everyone. Welcome. Is everybody here? Mr. Rosen, how are you? Okay, why don't we start with the pledge?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We have a lot to accomplish in an afternoon, so why don't we just go ahead and get started? And we have Mr. King here from the Salem District to give us an update on 58.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, members of the board. A quick update on Route 58 is what I will be providing. And Route 58, as many of you know, is Virginia's longest roadway, stretching 508 miles and encompassing 5 of the VDOT districts from Virginia Beach to the very tip of the western tip of Virginia. The Route 58 Corridor Development Fund is really a creation of the General Assembly back in 1989. The goal was to improve travel and enhance economic development potential across the largely rural southern portion of the state. The fund provides $40 million per year from the real estate recordation taxes. The work began on the East Coast, proceeded westward, and as a result, in 2003, there was 270 miles between Virginia Beach and really Stewart, Virginia, in the Salem District, had been improved to a 4-lane highway. There's 36 miles that remain between Stewart and Hillsville that will connect the Port of Virginia to Interstate 77. The graphic here shows the segments in green have already been completed, and I have a table that will give you some dates as to when that occurred, and then the red segments are the ones yet to be completed. Make note of the Interstate 77 corridor. A noteworthy point about 58 is this section of the Commonwealth does not have very many truck-improved routes to climb the mountainous grade in this western part of the state. So you have Interstate 77 is a truck-improved route. The only other truck-improved route really is up in Roanoke, all the way up the Interstate 81 corridor that is also paralleled by Route 11460 that's more than 50 miles and more than an hour away. So this section of Route 58, climbing this mountainous terrain, will provide a second and very important truck-worthy route to take traffic to the top of the mountain. The 3 segments that have been completed, you'll see about a 5-year increment, 2006, 11, and 16, Metazodan, Hillsville Bypass, and then the Tri-County and Laurel Fork segments. You'll see that the cost estimate of each are listed to the right. And the next table here shows the work that we have remaining, which is Lover's Leap, the most challenging of the segments along the corridor, Vesta and Crooked Oak. House Bill 1953, passed in 2013, prioritized the widening of Lover's Leap, Crooked Oak and Vesta as the sections that are the highest priority along the Route 58 corridor in Virginia, and it legislated that Lover's Leap would be the next project to be constructed. Lover's Leap, this gives you a little of the perspective of the terrain that we're climbing as we try to make this improvement. In the foreground of this picture is Interstate 64 westbound lanes going up Afton Mountain, and you'll see that that's a climb of approximately 4% grade. Additionally, on this graphic, these are about true elevations. So if you were to look in terms of the elevation that you are on the earth, in the background in the green is the backdrop of Lover's Leap climbing the mountain. Approximate 9% grade, 8 to 9, depending on which segment you are on the mountain. So certainly a pretty steep segment. The improvements here, so you're looking to the left of the screen of the western portion, you'll see Stewart labeled to the bottom right. And this is that segment that is predominantly Lover's Leap Mountain. You'll notice as you travel westward, you get to a point where you'll see the red lines split apart. The important factor of this is really at the base of the mountain where they split apart. You will climb in the westward direction up the mountain on what is the existing 2 lanes that exist today. They were improved back in the 1980s. They are roughly a grade of trying to remember now, their existing grade of about 8%. And that uphill gradient will remain. By dedicating both lanes to a westbound movement, you'll have the equivalent of a truck climbing lane. The little white tick mark you see there in the down gradient is actually a current truck escape ramp, and that's really one of the major safety problems of the corridor, is an 8% grade coming down the mountain is often too much for trucks to withstand. It is truck restricted. We do not allow interstate level 53-foot tractor trailers, but there are box trucks and other types of trucks that are enabled, and they oftentimes have difficulty holding that grade heading downhill. So the way in which that is improved, if you look to the top of the mountain where you come through that curve just under the word Lovers in the Lovers Leap label, you'll see that it splits, and that additional distance by going across on the other mountain ridge gives us more distance to travel the same elevation between 2 points, therefore lengthening it and allowing us to get to a 6.5% grade in the downhill direction. This will certainly make a significant safety improvement and enable a greater ability to serve truck traffic. As you get to the point where they re-meet, it is currently a grade of about 7.4%, and we will be able to make some improvements to that segment in the ultimate. It's very undulating currently, and we'll be able to get a more constant 7.4% grade going to the top of the mountain where you see the US 58 label. So where we are today, well, we are in and are continuing with preliminary engineering and the updating of the plans. Right-of-way status, we have 55 of 80 parcels that have been cleared, and 17 of the 22 relocations have been cleared, and our construction is expected to begin in 2021. So that is the update of this last segment of what has been a decade-long movement of improvements of US 58 as a part of that corridor development fund and program. Be glad to answer any questions, Madam Secretary.
This was actually the very first presentation that I listened to when I got this position.
That's
so,
right.
It's
yeah.
a quick
Very
update
good.
with
Indeed.
the commissioner. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Do you have any thoughts on allowing tractor trailers now to be able to go up, since you've got a truck lane going up the hill?
When the improvements are completed, that truck lane going up the hill will be there. Right now, that's a part of this next effort of Lover's Leap, is to actually create the additional lanes to dedicate those 2 existing lanes to the up gradient movement. So that's a part of this next project activity, and completion of that should enable the truck traffic to be on the mountain. Yes, sir.
You're looking also to have tractor trailers on the downward slope as well?
Yes, sir. And this should serve as a very needed relief to Interstate 77. As you know, Fancy Gap Mountain, and I'm sure you've heard of the fog-related problems that we have there. It's also very mountainous. We have rock slides from time. So if we do have some reason the mountain gets blocked, today, literally the redirect is through Roanoke or over into Tennessee. 58 will serve as one of those important relief valves to that. About 40,000 vehicles a day on Interstate 77 coming up the mountain.
Thank you very much.
8% is a pretty significant grade. Do you ever have instances where a truck can't make the grade?
But today in the down gradient at 8%, yes. And that's one of the things. We have in this segment over a 3-year period, we have about 100 crashes. About 50 of those crashes, about half, are injury crashes, and unfortunately 4 are fatalities. So we're much higher in terms of the expected fatality rate and injury rate. One of the things that's very concerning to the locals is when we do have a truck that can't maintain its control and it loses and does have an accident, it is similar to a cargo train related. It's a very visual event in terms of the cargo usually busts apart. It's like a train wreck at the bottom of the mountain oftentimes with these trucks. So very concerning to the locals. This is a bus route for school traffic. And but yeah, the 8% grade today is very problematic. The reason in which we have the restrictions that we have there is to help minimize that. But obviously there still has to be some level of commerce allowed on the mountain. And so there are some trucks that are allowed today.
On the after mountain, I see them chugging up
No.
there.
Even under the improved condition in the up gradient at an 8% grade, there'll be a slow moving, getting up that grade. But the additional lane will provide that bypass for other traffic.
I'd just say that right now we're in the preliminary phases of figuring out how to deliver this project and redevelopment these are antiquated plans. These are still in metrics, so we're still looking at updating this plan set and the delivery options. We're still evaluating those delivery options to be able to bring this project to fruition.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. King. Thanks for coming over.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Okay, mobile food vending. And it seems so appropriate at this time of day.
If only the weather was cooperating a little bit.
Oh, yes. May I say how unpredictable the weather is?
Good afternoon, Secretary, members of the board. I'm here to talk to you about mobile food vending in Northern Virginia commuter lots. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Next one after that. Next one after that, please.
I'm sorry?
Next slide. Sorry. Oh, I've got it. Oh, I've got the clicker. I'm sorry. All right. In 2016, in the General Assembly session, law was passed, Chapter 765, that directed the Commonwealth Transportation Board to allow mobile food vending in Planning District 8 commuter lots. Now, Planning District 8 is essentially Northern Virginia district. The law said that vendors must have permission from the Department of Health, from local governments, and that VDOT was to develop guidelines consistent with board's regulations. And the two regulations that are impacted are parking lots and environs and land use permit regulations. And the guidelines have to provide for the issuance of a land use permit, criteria to preserve safety, operation, and function of the lots, and to address other issues related to permit issuance. And the law also made any changes to the regulations exempt from the Administrative Process Act. Now, currently, VDOT owns or operates 27 commuter lots in Northern Virginia, but not all those lots are actually available for vending because 2 lots plus part of another one are considered interstate right-of-way, and federal rules prohibit commercialization of interstate right-of-way. The FHWA also requires market rate fees for fringe lots, and of all those lots, 7 lots are considered fringe lots. Now, market rate can be determined in 2 ways, either based on square footage lease rates or based upon similar permissions or operations that are allowed in other areas and how much they charge for them. In our studies of that, we found that the lease rate would be around $200, about $180. And in terms of similar permits, we know the Fairfax County Park Authority allows vending for $150 annual permit plus $150 per month or a share of the take. The City of Richmond allows these sort of things. And if the weather was better, you could go downtown here and you'd see vendors on the sidewalks and stuff, and they get charged $225 annually for that. Most of the lots also don't have a lot of space for this kind of vending because it has to be safe. You have to have a way to get pedestrians to the vending unit and around it, not get struck by cars coming in and out and things like that. And those are considerations that we had to work with. We solicited comments in 2016. We again solicited more in 2017 by posting to the Virginia Town Hall regulatory site. We also sent emails to interested parties because in 2015 we had done changes to allow vending on our roads that were programs that would be run by counties. So we had a list of already interested parties. We also sent notice out to the DC, Maryland, Virginia Mobile Food Truck Association and others, local governments, soliciting responses. We also attended a meeting with the bill's sponsor, Senator McPike, and he had gathered interested parties as well. So we got input from all those different sources. And generally speaking, the input was preserve operation of the lots, limit the number of vendors in each lot to 1 vendor, have the shortest possible term limit for the permits, and the interest was more for food van type vending and not for the kind of food carts you see out down here in Richmond frequently. Our recommendations: make changes to the land use permit regulations to make adjustments in the permit fee schedule to include mobile food vending, make that $200 for an annual permit. link to the rules and regulations to the administration of parking lots and environs, so that the two regulations are connected to each other. On the administration of parking lots and environs, prohibit vending in lots that are considered part of the interstate, prevent vending in lots that have an occupancy rate of greater than 98%, because remember, we're trying to preserve the operation of those lots, and prevent vending in lots where the locality says, hey, don't vend there, we have all these restaurants around them, we don't want any interference. Because it's a local zoning issue, we want to be respectful of that. For the vending requirements, one vendor per lot on weekdays, which means the weekends are available if they want to do a big vending circus or whatever they want to call them, those are still possible. Require that the vendor has a permission from the health department and the locality, and prohibit vending posting advertisements in the lots, because then we're running afoul of outdoor advertising regulations. The vendors have to follow permit conditions. Vending has to be pedestrians only, not directly to vehicles. And the vending, of course, has to not interfere with the operation of the lots. In terms of the land use permit conditions, we would have conditions that would cover the location of the vending unit. Once again, we're looking at safety. Disposal of litter, vending times, and then insurance and surety requirements to make sure they clean up after themselves and they take care of the lot when they're there. And board approval will be required for any regulatory changes, and I hope to bring you a draft resolution at the next meeting.
Any questions? Mr. Rosen?
Last slide.
We're looking at something around $1,000, that sort of thing. It's just to make sure that they clean up after themselves, collect up any trash that's done as a result of their activities, or if there's any trampling of the grass and that sort of thing, that we would get reseeding and things like that. So it's not a lot.
Madam Chairman, I appreciate the work that went into this. I think it's an important conversation. I will say that I think we doom it to failure by having one vendor at a time. And the reason is that I think everybody's experience with these food carts and stuff is that people like choices. And so I think that the way I see these being used in my neck of the woods is more in the evening than in the morning. People are stopping to pick up a meal before they go home, or, I mean, flowers. This is about food vending, but it's sort of like there's an accumulation of uses there that makes sense for people to put it into their habit to stop. We might charge 5 different people $200, but how many days do they get? I think there's some operational kinds of things here that will lead to this not being very successful. I do like the idea that our lots could be used on the weekends for something larger, and maybe that'll be clearer when we actually see the regs. But if the locality is fine with more than one vendor and we can work the safety piece out, I don't know why we would say only one vendor. I think they'll be more successful if there are more of them. That's just based on experience.
What was the rationale for one vendor?
Interestingly enough, the industry actually requested that. In our meeting that Senator Pike sponsored, that was one of the comments that we were getting is, hey, we don't want a whole bunch of vendors here because we're paying this money to be out there. We would like us to sort of have a temporary monopoly, if you want to consider it that way. So that was a request of the industry.
As a longtime landlord, I think the price is ridiculously cheap. I mean, $200 for an annual permit. The Fairfax thing is $150 plus $150 a month. I mean, you're going to have so many people apply. It's incredible. We're giving it away.
Well, then how do you decide
Right,
who gets
first?
what?
Because the price is way too cheap. Way too cheap.
So are you still working with, do you have a working group with which you're working with?
There was a group that was assembled by McPike. We can go back to them and straighten anything out that needs to be straightened out. A couple of the issues dealing that we've just discussed, the interest was really high initially, and part of that was because they saw this as a really good audience, and they were mostly looking at it actually in the morning, not for the afternoon.
Which I think is their mistake.
Yeah. And then, about midway through this, and this is one of the reasons it's taken so long, they discovered that, wait a minute, Metro buses and Metro Rail do not allow food, most carpools are not going to allow it, and that sort of made interest wane a little bit at that point.
I've actually been amazed in Clarendon where I live. We now have food trucks lining the blocks around the Clarendon Metro stop, even though we have many, many bricks and mortar restaurants. And it's all about that, like 5:30 to 7:30 time when people are getting off the train and they want to stop and pick something up. So there's a market there if the food truck folks are willing to drive there in the evening.
The other thing is, we do have a wide range in terms of the study that we did in terms of what would be considered market rate. I was recommending 200 as the initial because I'm looking at the low end, but we don't have to go just at that point. We can, like I said, essentially it's $180 to almost $2,000 in terms of the range.
Maybe it could be tied to ridership. You know, how much of a hub is it? How many buses come in? Is there a metro stop there? So that the price might vary based on the size of the audience, the potential audience.
Maybe how full the lot is? Because we have statistics on that. We actually gather that.
Perhaps what we could do is have a follow-up meeting, invite the delegate. Is there a deadline for this being implemented?
There was no deadline set. Unfortunately, we have sort of dragged this out now, so we're about 2 years down the road. So it'd be good if we could finish at least in some reasonable short time.
Yes. Well, but I think these are all really good comments that, you know, perhaps we could incorporate into a plan, and perhaps during the next month, for anyone who might be interested or might have some experience in working in this area, we could just give some final input to this before we actually make a final recommendation. Be open to that? Okay. So Carol, will you put that on the list that we will get back to the board, we'll solicit input, and then perhaps we'll have one final meeting in putting this forward. I had also asked when I first learned about this, about looking at risks and what kind of risk the Commonwealth was assuming by having vendors on our property and organizing this process. And so were you able to look into that, or what our standard procedures would be in looking at vendors or who would be there?
Right. Yes, we did look into that, and all of the counties where this would be taking place have a requirement for background checks in order for people to get a vendor permit. And since they're required to have that permit before they can apply to our permit, we're covered that way. In addition, all of our permits have a hold the Commonwealth Transportation Board, the Commonwealth, VDOT employees harmless clause in the permit. So we should be covered for that as well.
I wasn't sure what risk we would be assuming in soliciting the vendors and kind of launching and taking responsibility for this, voting on this. So that was really good to know. And I think it was Deputy Secretary Quentin Elliott who let us know that there were procedures in place, and it was nice to know what they are. Mr. Tunk.
I'm sorry if I missed this in the presentation, but I guess my general question is why is VDOT getting into this?
Because the General Assembly told us to.
Okay.
And since you have already invested 2 years into this process, I think taking a month and for this board to be able to understand fully what we're actually get into would be very helpful.
Ma'am.
Okay. Is that good? All right. Thank you. Oh, Mr. Latimer, how are you? Welcome.
Good afternoon, Madam Secretary and members of the board. We have 2 rail industrial access applications we've received to go over this afternoon. First one is Seagate Terminals. They are located on the Norfolk Portsmouth Beltline Railroad, which serves the port down in Chesapeake and Portsmouth. Seagate receives their incoming cargo by barge and currently ships out most of their product by truck. And this project would move that product onto rail, as well as the expansion of the facility. They would grow their traffic and divert truck traffic from the highways. So Seagate is expanding their facility with additional full-time employees, purchase of heavy equipment and machinery, and adding conveyance systems to the loading dock, and rehabilitating the existing warehouse. And the expansion will offer rail capacity to ship out dry bulk materials and help divert truck traffic from the congested roadways of Hampton Roads. The application is for $450,000. Their total capital expenditure is $4 million. The rail construction project cost is estimated at $500,000. Anything above the $450,000 grant would be the responsibility of the applicant. They are anticipating an additional 510 additional rail cars every year. They really only receive one right now. Everything goes by truck. And they would have 10 new jobs. And after the project is complete, they anticipate 90% of their shipping would be outbound by rail. The application scored 62 points of 100 points possible. And with so many jobs and other benefits and capital expenditures, their minimum threshold would be a requirement of 101 new carloads within 3 years.
Before I open it up for any questions about this particular one, in case Mr. Williams is listening, we are only bringing this forward because he's not here.
We were going to ask for a vote next month, but...
Oh, there you go. I looked over, I was ready.
He's texted me already.
Did he? That's great. Well, before we move to the next one, any questions about this particular
Secretary?
project? Yes, sir.
Hey, Jeremy, this morning you quoted a number of trucks, the trucks that this would replace. Can you just refresh that number?
Yes, so the equivalent truck diversion would be about 1,700 truckloads a year.
So just in the very crowded area that truck traffic is already a factor, I think it's significant that it's taking 1,700 trucks off the road.
90% now moving to rail.
There you go. That's a good number.
Madam Secretary, as I mentioned at the earlier committee meeting, I visited the site, visited with the people. They're really putting this investment to work, and it already is a congested area, and having this rail capacity only enhances that entire industrial park.
Thank you. Good to know. Anything else? Yes, Mr. Tunk.
When you look at the obvious benefits of this project, why is the score not higher than 62? Seems like it's kind
We
of...
have talked about, we could revisit the scoring system, but getting 100 points is almost impossible the way it's set up. 62 is what staff would consider a strong showing. You have to meet at least 50 to get recommended.
Okay.
Great inflation here. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Next, application, also rail industrial access, it's from the Buckingham Branch Railroad. Give it just a second. Okay, so Buckingham Branch Railroad has made this application it would serve a facility that is located in King William County, Virginia, but the transload facility that Buckingham Branch operates is located in Hanover at Doswell. The Nestle Purina plant has utilized this facility with a previous rail industrial access application, and this is a picture here of the current facility, which was funded with rail industrial access grants about 5 years ago. So this would be an expansion of that facility. Nestle Purina receives clay from out west, and then it is moved to trucks and trucked the rest of the way into the facility in King William, which does not have rail access. And with that, they make kitty litter, and all of that is outbound by truck. So the Buckingham Branch Railroad is the applicant because they own the facility. It'll support the Nestle Purina expansion, which will allow shipment of over 100,000 tons of clay per year by rail. The application is for $450,000 in rail access funds. The expansion capital expenditure is $12.4 million. The rail cost is estimated at $600,000, and anything above the $450,000 grant would be the responsibility of the applicant. They currently are running about 950 rail cars a year, which exceeds their original expectations. They're anticipating an additional 200 carloads with 37 new jobs at the facility in King William. 100% of their inbound shipping would be by rail and then transferred to truck and moved to the facility in King William. The application score is 66 of 100 points. Because of the strong jobs and rail cars run already, the minimum threshold would be the minimum that we require of 10 new rail cars a year.
Right. I think we talked about this in the Rail Committee this morning as well. I think this is a good example of, and the original project was also funded with some of our rail funds as well. And I think it's a good example of a project that's actually far exceeded our expectations and the Buckingham branch's expectations. So this is actually, will essentially be expanding this, again, leveraging some of the funds that we put in at really with, I think, very significant benefits. So.
I will just add, and certainly Director Mitchell can clarify my comment, but as Mr. Williams and others have brought to our attention, where do these programs actually lie as far as economic development? Should it be in commerce or VEDP? And one of the things that VEDP is looking at all of our incentive programs across Virginia, and so this being one of them. So there is an agency actually looking at where these programs actually should reside. So until then, we're going to continue doing this and trying to put forward the best projects that we can. But these two seem to have exceeded a lot of expectations.
Madam Secretary?
Yes, sir. Mr. Dixon, we missed you at the last meeting.
I was here. Jeremy, I didn't quite understand. It says it's going to estimate at 205 carloads. That's new carloads, is that correct?
It's above the 956.
Yet the minimum threshold of 10 new carloads, how does that jive?
We reworked the performance policy in the past. Instead of setting it at the specific number that they anticipate, which we had some grantees where things didn't turn out like they liked, and we did not give credit for the other items that were evaluated up front, such as creation of jobs, capital expenditures invested in the community, and things like that. So now the system takes into account all of those items, and then you set a threshold of carloads that keeps them at least above the 50 points that they would have to meet. Does that? And it's a little bit convoluted of an explanation, but...
Well, you really just discounted carloads, is that correct?
Yes.
Which then makes it an economic development issue rather than a transportation issue.
Yes.
And I know we've, in the past, we've had issues where somebody has been overly estimated and got more points, 80, I remember those 180, 85 points, and it's because they had an enormous number of threshold carloads, which they didn't get, and then we had to back down. But looks to me like we ought to have some sort of, rather than just plugging in the minimum, at least for the fact that we are talking transportation, we ought to have some reasonable amount of additional new carloads in the formula, and if it creates an 80-point score, that's great, but it just seems like that's a flawed number.
Madam Secretary, Jeremy today indicated that there's 8 inputs into the score, and they are weighted, and carloads gets 20% of the weight, so there's 80% other factors that represent the score.
Right, it's a strong project, and my point is 10 carloads is a meaningless estimate if they're thinking of 250, 205. I mean, even 50 or 60 or something to make this a transportation issue.
Yes.
And just to clarify, the minimum threshold refers to the amount that we would require to go back and claw back the money if they don't meet it. And we scale that. This was a change that was made by the CTB back in 2015 when we looked at our performance criteria, was to, we acknowledge that because if a project has a lot of benefits with jobs and they meet those benefits, we should provide flexibility on the amount of carloads that they have to meet before we claw back funds. So that's really why we have this minimum threshold, is to say they do still have to move some carloads. I agree that it looks very small in the scale of how much they're going to be moving overall. But I think really the 205 carloads is the important number that we feel that they're going to, we feel at least that that's achievable. So
I agree. All I'm saying is it's a stronger program than what 66 points indicates. And we did that in 215. That was the Carmoose item, I believe, where they then lost a contract and had to reduce the amount. Still had well over 50 points, but it just seems to me like there ought to be some sort of realistic tracking of carloads.
And one of the things that we'll be doing, we talked about this morning with the Rail Committee, is revisiting the CTB's policy on this project, including we're going to talk about the scoring criteria as well and make sure that they still represent the CTB's goals with that. So,
Jeremy, so in the case of the application that we're considering, the disparity between, to Mr. Whitworth's point, between the number of carloads required to meet their target of 10 and the expectation of 205, that's a big gap. Are we protected with regard to them shifting this traffic to truck rather than rail and still meeting a minimal requirement, and we've made this investment? I mean, I guess, is it a question of business uncertainty or modal options that has that great a disparity in it?
Well, to the first question, are we protected? We don't monitor the ratio that we now ask for up front. That's not something that, they report their actual carloads to us every year.
But we ask for the truck component of that.
We don't ask for that as the part of the performance. We just ask for what the carloads are.
I guess my only concern in this, we did discuss this in the Rail Committee, is, having a 5% target that makes them compliant seems just very small in the context of if they have business certainty in this, or if there's uncertainty, maybe that's valid. But if the uncertainty comes from their choice of mode, and that's the end client on this, then I think that's a different situation. And we should find a way to make certain that we're not making an investment where the recipient of the benefits decides they'd rather truck than rail, and that we don't do a clawback. So that would be the only comment I would make on this.
Remember being on the Rail Committee in the very beginning, and part of the concern was the number of clawbacks that we were being faced with. So we went and expanded, because it was really just based on carloads at the time. So we expanded the criteria. So we looked at jobs and economic impact of these decisions. And so we did weight them across the board, 8 different factors. Maybe it's time now that we could look and try to see if we could estimate these figures more realistically. I think part of it was they would overestimate the number of carloads to get a higher number to access the funds. So I think trying to perhaps match it more accurately does at this point seem to make some sense. Yes, sir.
Chairman, this is what I received. I had the pleasure of visiting the site last week on my way back from a TSDAC meeting, and although it's in Carlos Brown's district, I went ahead and just did it, because I'd never seen one of these projects. So this is what Brian Friedman sent me as a follow-up. The Purina Company, which this feeds, has invested $100 million in capital improvements to its plant in King William, and its employment over the same period has grown from 193 to 302. Additionally, the transload facility directly supports 3 Hoof Corporation employees and 2 Buckingham branch employees in Hanover County. Doswell Transload and Rail Service has played an important role in Purina's business by offering an economical way to move nearly 100,000 tons per year of raw material to the King William plant, which does not have direct rail access. Using the rail-to-truck logistics model versus truck direct keeps about 4,000 truckloads per year off Virginia's interstate system. As a result of Purina's growth, the volume of carloads they require to maintain production has exceeded the capacity of our facility. The sidetrack expansion will add an additional 22 rail cars spots to the facility, which will enable B&B, Buckingham Branch and Hoof to continue to meet Purina's demands. So this is a repeat recipient, right, and they've got a great track record. I think Hoof or Buckingham Branch had received these funds before, and they exceeded expectations, and this is their second bite of the apple. So I think the metrics are sound. Who knew that cat litter was such a prosperous thing in America? But anyway, the plant is growing, and this seems to be a great feeder for that plant.
Say, okay, you'll bring this back next month, and we'll actually vote. We will welcome Mr. Williams at that point. But in the meantime, I do think maybe the Rail Committee could look at these figures to see if we could make it, bring more clarity to it.
This is a strong
Yes.
application, probably the strongest we've looked at. So I've thoroughly...
I'd say they both are.
Yeah.
Both good
They're both so
applications.
good.
My only concern is 10 cars is not much of a bottom floor to maintain funding.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lauer. Ms. Brown. Wouldn't be a CTB meeting without you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, members of the board. Today I'm going to brief you on a proposed policy change for our high-volume unpaved road program. First, I'll give you a little background about the history of the program. The high-volume unpaved road program was established in 2014 by the board. This policy sets aside 10% of the CTB formula funds available for unpaved roads to provide additional supplemental funding for those unpaved roads that carry over 500 vehicles per day. When the program was established in 2014, there were 28 counties that had eligible high-volume unpaved road projects representing roughly 44 miles. We established an application-based program. We seek applications each year. In fact, applications are due for the program this year, this Friday. So by Friday, we will know what the demand will be for this year for this funding. Since 2014, the board has approved funding for 13 projects and has allocated approximately $3.5 million. Next slide. So that brings us to where we are today. So based on our current inventory, today we have 9 counties that have eligible routes that meet the high-volume unpaved road criteria. The last 3 fiscal years, when we have sought applications, we have actually received less requests for funding than we have funds available for distribution, which is a good thing. So main reason we are here today is the CTB policy as established indicated that the CTB policy would allocate 10% no matter what. And so there really is no flexibility to make adjustments based on a lessened demand for the program funds. Oh, should I be? So, a recommendation. Current policy indicates that the board will set aside 10% of the funding for the high-volume unpaved road program, and that the maximum request will be $300,000 per locality. So the primary policy revision that we are recommending is that we add the words up to 10% to allow the board the flexibility to make adjustments based on actual demand. Also, as part of this discussion, we've been looking at the remaining unpaved roads that are out there that have high volume, trying to see what the demand is long term. And based on that discussion, in order to try to wrap up these existing high-volume unpaved roads, we also would like to throw out the suggestion for a possible increase in the maximum available per county to $500,000 per locality. That $300,000 per locality per year was really established to make sure that the funds were distributed across many localities and not all funding going to 1 or 2 localities. But given that our demand is less, I think we could safely say we could go up to $500,000 per year and help some of these localities that have multiple high-volume unpaved road projects get those paved. With these policy changes, it would allow that if we have more funding than we have requests, the extra funding could be redistributed back to the statewide unpaved road program, which would provide a benefit to all counties, and that they would see an increase in their unpaved road funding.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Brown?
Is there a reason why these localities would not want to make the request for the funding for these projects?
We actually are down to very few. There are a couple that have high volumes that will not be seeking funds, and so we actually did inquire the reason why for some of these. We have one that apparently the county received a smart scale funded project that is going to realign an intersection, and the resident engineer indicated that as part of that realignment, that current unpaved road project will likely see a significant reduction in traffic. So his recommendation is that they complete the smart scale project, then do a traffic count on the roadway. And he said once some of the through traffic is no longer on that unpaved road portion, he thinks the count will go down well below the threshold for high volume. We have another one that apparently it's in Isle of Wight County, and they indicate that it's a roadway that sees a lot of washing, and they feel like the road is probably better maintained as an unpaved road than it would be with the paved surface based on some of the washing issues they have on that roadway. One of the other things I'll point out is that these funds were intended to be supplemental funding, and so for many counties, they're getting unpaved roads for other projects. And so some of these projects, while they might be high volume, they may not be the #1 priorities in their county, so they may not have placed them in their 6-year plan. But we are pretty close to eliminating the balance of those projects that we have, roads that we have out there that have those higher volumes. In terms of our next steps, we are asking for this to be on this month's action meeting, and the primary reason for that is we are getting ready to send out the unpaved road allocations that the counties would have available for this year's secondary 6-year plan. So if there are extra funds, we'd like for the counties to have the benefit to allocate those funds this year. And the current resolution does not include the increase from $300,000 to $500,000, but if the board is agreeable, we'll make that modification in the draft resolution to be presented tomorrow. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Any issues or concerns about the revised policy?
To comment, I think we should commend the engineer or planner who made the decision to hold off on paving the unpaved road. That's a good example of scrutinizing the situation before we make the investment. So.
And I will say that we did have the discussion. We were trying to get this done as quickly as possible so that they would have access, the jurisdictions would have access to the funds, which is why we're presenting today and voting tomorrow, which I know is not the way we prefer to do things. But in this particular case, it would allow us to move more projects forward. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Deputy Secretary Quentin Elliott, I'm going to ask a question. What time would we anticipate having a special guest today?
We are looking and so I will step out a few minutes earlier, and so depending on how the presentations go, I may or may not be in for mine, and so we may have to move around.
Okay. Well, and I just say that because we do have the governor coming in this afternoon to welcome you all, and I would say reintroduce himself to all of you. So wanted just to make sure you were aware of that. And given that he is coming this afternoon, I was wondering if we could shift the program a bit and go to the legislative update. Just in case we learned something, or perhaps you might want to ask a question about some of the decisions that have come forward. So is that possible to do?
Ma'am.
Yeah, okay. Of course, I'm looking for Joanne Maxwell.
She'll be up next.
But I thought at least having an update on where we are legislatively would make sense, so. Welcome, Mr. Donahue.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, members of the board. Nick Donahue, Deputy Secretary of Transportation. While they're pulling up my presentation here, I'm going to hit on kind of four big issues that were dealt with from the transportation perspective during session. Really a few key issues: the regional gas tax floor, which is an issue we've talked about with this board for several years now, the WMATA and mass transit omnibus legislation that was passed, an I-81 corridor study legislation, and then also some additional changes to programming processes here at the board, as well as some transparency things that were passed by the General Assembly. So the first piece of legislation I want to talk about is really what a lot of folks have described as an oversight from the 2013 revenue bill. So for those of you who have been on the board for some...
I'm going to just pause you for 1 second. Do we have this? Oh, is it being loaded? You have it. I just want to make sure. I know we're searching for it. Not to say we can't read it.
See it here.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. I knew we were...
Any delay is solely my fault. I just want to take credit where credit is due. So I apologize.
It's never happened before, I'm sure.
But for those of you who've been on the board for some time, as you may recall, in the 2013 revenue package, when we switched from a cents per gallon tax on gas to a sales tax on gas, we said, oh, the tax on fuel will be 5% of the wholesale price of fuel, unless the wholesale price of fuel goes lower than it was on February 20th of 2013. That ended up being a lifesaver for the state transportation program, because currently the wholesale price of fuel is around $2, maybe even lower. Mr. Malbin might be able to correct me there. However, in the regions which have a 2.1% sales tax on gas, we were not did not have a similar foresight, and no price floor was instituted there. And so the revenues that have been collected by these regional gas taxes in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads have dropped precipitously over the past 4 years. There have been numerous legislative attempts to try and correct this, again, described by some as an oversight, described as by others as something different over the last 4 years. This past year, though, they were successful. So I'm happy to say that the House and the Senate passed by wide bipartisan majorities legislation to address this oversight from the 2013 transportation package. You can see it generates a fair amount of money in Northern Virginia and in Hampton Roads. Again, I would say this is money people expected to be flowing to the regions, but wasn't received because of the failure to include a price floor in that 2013 legislation. Regardless of how you want to characterize this situation, I think it's a good thing for transportation in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads that we were able to move forward with this. It really does help shore up the funds for these three different transportation commissions throughout the state. The next piece of legislation I want to talk about is an extremely large bill that had many moving parts and changed multiple times throughout session. I think this is something Madam Secretary, myself, and Director Mitchell spent the vast majority of session working on, and this is the WMATA and mass transit omnibus bill. There were several competing versions of this bill. There were several versions in the Senate. There were a few versions in the House. What I'm going to talk to you about is the conference report that came out of the House and Senate as the negotiators worked together to come up with a compromise piece of legislation that could be passed. At this point, the bill is before the governor. The governor, as always, reserves his right to review all legislation, consider options. I don't believe any decisions have been made at this point, but that is the posture of this legislation. This bill did pass with pretty high margin in the House and a healthy margin in the Senate. It does a few key things. It provides WMATA with $154 million a year and dedicated, permanent, and ongoing funding. For you, those of you who might be wondering, why did we end up at $154 million? That is Virginia's share of the $500 million that the WMATA General Manager Paul Wiedefeld has identified as being necessary to address the maintenance backlog and maintain a state of good repair on the WMATA rail system. Maryland would owe $167 and D.C. would owe approximately $179 million. We all pay based on ridership, population, and other factors that really inform that formula. The bill also requires implementation of key reforms at WMATA, and I'm going to go through these in more detail. It provides VRE with $15 million in permanent, dedicated, and ongoing funding, and it also requires implementation of certain reforms for the state's transit program, as well as certain reforms at specific transit agencies in the Commonwealth. So for WMATA, what the bill does is it creates a special fund that is put in place that has all the various revenue sources that are deposited into that. Those funds can only be spent on WMATA capital purposes. They cannot go to operating. They cannot go to local bus service. They cannot go anywhere outside of the WMATA compact jurisdictions in Virginia. They can be used overall for that system. 80% of those revenues are bondable, which is very important. WMATA for years has been the one heavy rail transit system in America that hasn't had dedicated funding, which means when they have capital assets that they need to purchase like rail cars, they can't go to the financing markets like New York, Chicago, Philly, LA, or any other rail transit system would. And if you think about what that means, 4 years ago, WMATA spent $400 million, excuse me, on rail cars, and they were replacing rail cars that have been running on the system since basically 1980. So we know they last a long time, but yet we were using cash to purchase these assets. With this new fund and similar funds being created in Maryland and D.C., they will finally be able to use financing to purchase these long-term assets. And that brings me to the other key point. None of this becomes effective unless Maryland and D.C. pass bills providing their share of the $500 million. So I know some of you may have seen discussions in the Washington Post where some of the other partners were at one point saying, oh, well, we'll all just pay $150, even Stevens. That should be fair, and that just doesn't work for Virginia. There are a whole host of legal issues that if anyone is particularly interested in, I'll get into offline, but Virginia needs to pay under the WMATA formula for this to pass legal muster, and so that is why we're providing our $154 million and not an even share. The revenue sources from this come from a lot of different places. 30 million of it is existing state resources that are redirected. 1% of that, or 10 million of that, excuse me, does come from the VDOT State of Good Repair Program, and the other 20 million are state general funds that were previously dedicated to Northern Virginia that are being redirected to this purpose. We then, essentially, what is proposed in the bill would be to repeal two existing regional taxes that currently go to the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority and reimpose those in the WMATA jurisdictions. And the net effect of that is a reduction in revenues for the regional authority in Northern Virginia that currently invest in other transportation projects there. And that is the 2% transient occupancy tax and the 15 cents per $100 of assessed value grantor's tax. And I'll get into more detail about the impacts of the authority in the next slide. There also is $22 million from the gas tax price floor that I talked about in the previous bill that was passed. So in order of sequences, the gas tax bill came out of conference and passed, and then 2 days later, this bill came out and immediately spent some of the new money that was generated by the bill that had passed 2 days previously. And then the final chunk of money in this account is $27 million that local governments are required to pay out of the money they receive from the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. And so as a quick refresher, the authority receives a certain amount of money each year, and 70% of that is available for region-wide projects picked by that authority, and then 30% is returned to each of those local governments. And the local governments that are members of the WMATA Compact would be required to pay pro rata their shares of $27 million to round out this funding package. So as you can see, this is a kind of bill that scraped together a whole host of revenue sources to get to $154 million. This is a compromise position from the conference committee. This was not the bill the administration was advocating for. We were working very closely with Senator Saslaw and Senator Barker, as well as Delegate Sullivan, to advance a proposal that would have included some additional tax increases to be able to meet this 154. But this is the bill that's currently before the governor, and as I said, the governor is listening to stakeholders and will be reviewing this legislation over the coming weeks. The way the money is raised does have an impact on the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. So today that authority currently has 3 regional taxes that are imposed. If this bill were to become law, 2 of those taxes would be repealed. You can see overall that's about $80-some million a year in revenue that would no longer go to the authority, and so the authority's overall revenues would go from about $350 million down to about $270. on an annual basis, and again, that would grow slightly over time. The bill does propose repealing those, and again, we impose a new tax in the WMATA compact jurisdictions. There are 3 localities that are members of the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority but are not members of the WMATA compact, and the bill does reimpose local taxes in those 3 jurisdictions to make sure that they still have the same amount of resources available for transportation, and that's Prince William, Manassas, and Manassas Park. The bill includes a host of reforms to the WMATA transit system. I think the first one is really important for this board, which is today, as we distribute transit funds, a lot of times that is based on essentially the amount of requests that we receive. WMATA tends to only put in a discrete number of requests, but if they took a different course, they could have put in a lot of additional applications and taken a much greater share of the statewide funding. And so what this bill does is it provides WMATA with a fixed percentage of the state's transit program. And that really does 2 key things. One, it gives WMATA certainty. As we looked at their funding allocations over the last 4 or 5 years, it kind of went up and down, sometimes by as much as $20 to $25 million over a year. And so now they'll know exactly what they'll be getting, give or take, into the future, and be able to predict that and count on that money as they're developing their budget. Secondly, it makes sure for the other transit systems throughout the state that they know WMATA is not going to come in each year and take an increasingly greater and greater share of that state transit program. The other change that this does is today, when funds go to WMATA, there's a certain amount that's for operating and a certain amount that's for capital, and this would allow the region to collectively have more flexibility and decide whether to use these funds for operating or capital expenses, which provides some additional flexibility to Northern Virginia as they develop the WMATA budget. I think the biggest reform that was discussed during the legislative process was really how do we deal with WMATA's operating costs request. For years, those requests have gone up pretty significantly. That was a big discussion of the LaHood report. Again, I think the LaHood report found the reasons for it going up were related to namely pensions, state of good repair, and a few very discrete issues. It wasn't rail car purchases as well. It wasn't related to like systemic mismanagement within the WMATA system. It was related to a very few kind of key factors. And so what we agreed upon is instead of dictating to WMATA how they should achieve cost savings, simply give the general manager a goal and allow the manager to manage the transit system that he operates. And so what we say is that WMATA's operating assistance from Virginia is essentially capped at 3% growth a year. If they go over that amount, then 35% of the state funding for WMATA would be withheld for noncompliance. So 35% of the 53.5% of the state transit program the board would be required by law to withhold that. Now, I want to be clear, this 3% cap does exclude certain items that we know are going to have result in increase in operating costs. So, for example, Silver Line Phase 2 is scheduled to open in 2 to 3 years. That is going to increase operating costs. We spent several $1 billion to build that rail line, and so we now need to pay to operate it. And so things like that are exempted from this determination, as are legal disputes or other proceedings of that nature. And so there are a few exemptions to this that I do think are very important. The original proposal from Governor McAuliffe proposed implementing the Reform Board as proposed by Secretary Ray LaHood, which would have cut the WMATA board from effectively 16 members down to 5. We did work with Maryland and D.C., and we ultimately ended up at an 8-member board. And the way this is accomplished in the bill is they simply say that alternates are prohibited from participating in board meetings unless a principal board member is absent. And that would effectively, again, scale that board down by 50%. And the enforcement tool is that 20% of the state funding to WMATA would be withheld if alternate members participated in a meeting while the principal members were present. One of the other things that is included in the bill is a requirement that the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission report annually on WMATA's condition and performance. I think one of the things that we found in 2017 as the lead up to this discussion is a lot of people had thoughts and opinions about how WMATA was operating. Very few people actually had the facts and figures necessary to talk about what was actually taking place. That was part of the reason why Governor McAuliffe hired Secretary LaHood to undertake that review. So instead of everyone arguing with a different set of facts, facts. We had one set of figures that we all could agree were accurate, and based our discussions about how to move forward with that system using one set of facts. So we want to keep the reporting that the LaHood report put in place moving forward. So as we talk about WMATA, we understand collectively as decision makers what is taking place at that system, and also that we're able to keep them accountable and can start to see if there are deviations from the performance that was identified in the LaHood report. There are two other items required of WMATA. The first is to annually adopt a 6-year capital improvement program. For those of you on this board, that should sound very familiar. You do it every year with your 6-year improvement program. Unfortunately, for the last few years, WMATA has been operating with single-year capital improvement programs, and we have discussed this issue with former WMATA board members who thought it would be good for WMATA to really program out, say what they're going to build, and have that real longer-term capital program. If they're going to be undertaking a $15 billion rebuilding program over the next 10 years, they certainly need to be planning that out multiple years in advance, and so the bill would require them to do that starting the next fiscal year. The other thing the bill does require is for WMATA to adopt a strategic plan every 3 years outlining their business initiatives and other strategic efforts that they plan to undertake in the coming years. And the first plan to comply with this bill would need to include strategies as how WMATA would plan to address some of the recommendations included in the LaHood report. And just to remind the board members, like one of the key findings was a mismatch in the amount of bus service provided relative to the amount of ridership on that system. And I do know the general manager has already started talking about doing a refresh of that bus network. And so I do think WMATA is embracing a lot of the issues that were identified in that LaHood report and are moving forward with it. For both these items, the authority would be required to hold a public hearing in Northern Virginia jurisdictions prior to adoption. And similar with the other provisions, there is a 20% withholding of state funding for noncompliance if WMATA does not comply. The last two items of the reforms in this, the first says that for any project located solely within the Commonwealth of Virginia and initiated after July 1, 2018, the contracts for that project cannot discriminate or encourage participation in project labor agreements. There's already a similar piece of law in place for contracts awarded by VDOT or DRPT, and this provision would seek to extend a similar concept for WMATA projects solely located within the Commonwealth that start after this bill would become effective. And then the final piece of the WMATA reforms is the establishment of a Metro Reform Commission. This would consist of 4 members of the General Assembly, or appointed by the General Assembly, 2 from the House and 2 from the Senate, that would review WMATA's Labor Arbitration Act, or the National Capital Region Labor Arbitration Act. I may have misstated the acronym, but basically to review WMATA's labor policies and to make recommendations to Congress and I guess the other signatories of the WMATA Compact regarding that. It's unclear exactly if the commission is implemented, how their recommendations will be heeded by the other jurisdictions who don't have members on it. I would just say it's a part of the legislation, and again, this is the conference report. There was a compromise between all sides moving forward. Any questions on the WMATA reforms before I move into some of the other aspects of this bill?
Just a comment. I think sitting here 6 months ago, I wasn't really sure whether we'd get to this day where this funding had been accomplished. And I can't imagine the background work that went in on the part of the 3 of you in particular, but well done. It's very meaningful in the context of the future of the Commonwealth, Northern Virginia in particular.
I just want to add some flavor to Nick's report and the current situation in Northern Virginia. I think there's a push and pull going on with the regionalists, I will call them, who are certainly behind Metro now, and the coalition that's developed in the business community throughout I'll call it the DMV. And those people, groups and elected officials who are concerned about the effect on NVTA's dollars. So everybody's for regionalism. Everybody's looking at how important Metro is to the whole region, especially in light of the dangling carrot of HQ2, Amazon. But yet, a third of the funding gone from NVTA, I'll call it the rob Peter to pay Paul, in terms of Metro is a concern. And I just was informed, because Nick and I were talking about this prior to the start of the meeting, that the Northern Virginia Transportation Coalition, which is the Alliance, NVBIA, NAOP, the Realtors, the Tech Council, and all the chambers, are preparing a letter to the governor now saying that the funding sources for the bill need to be reviewed and alternative sources sought. It should not be either or funding for transportation in the region. So Nick, that's kind of the deep background I was trying to get to you, but I just received this. But I thought the board should know what's going on and what the conversation is in Northern Virginia right now regarding where this current compromise legislation is and where the business community and various elected officials throughout the DMV think about this. Everybody's for getting those dollars for Metro, but how they were secured is I think the debate that's going on now. And I don't know if Mary or Scott want to add to that as well.
Madam Secretary, if I might, the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority has had one meeting since the conference report came out, and they were scheduled to have one tomorrow, but it's been postponed because of the weather. But I would say Gary captured the sense of that authority. Most people had kind of made their peace with losing one of their three financing sources. Losing two of them is a much harder thing for the whole group for a variety of different reasons. And I know that their hope is also to send the governor a consensus letter from the jurisdictions who are participating in the authority. I think all of us were prepared to accept additional taxes. And I think most people in our region were prepared to accept additional taxes. So it's unfortunate that we're having to pit transit against the need for other kinds of transportation improvements in the region because we have such a large amount of need. So we'll see what happens. I think a lot of folks are hoping the governor can find a way to at least bring a few more dollars to the table. The last thing I'll say on behalf of the jurisdictions is the additional contribution from the jurisdictions was also hard for people to swallow. And they said, yeah, we'll find a way. But as an example, one of the jurisdictions didn't have enough 30% money from the MBTA funds to cover the ask moving into the next thing. And so we'll have to go in and use local dollars. So there's a lot of, yeah, we really need this fixed, but this is highly, highly constrained in a way that we wish it wasn't, because our folks were ready, I think, to pay more.
Mr. Brown.
So I'm assuming that the analysis was done as to the NVTA bonding that's already taken place, and are there that the remaining revenues, absent the dollars that are being lost, are adequate to support the revenue needs to support those bonds?
Madam Chair, Mr. Brown, I don't want to speak for the authority because we have not. They have their own financial advisors, and I believe they are currently asking them multiple questions. There's certainly an impact to the authority's debt capacity, without question. I would also say with certainty that the amount of remaining revenues are more than adequate to cover the existing debt. I think the unanswered question that the authority is posing to its financial advisors is what, from a precedent perspective, how will the credit market react to potentially the reduction of, $80 million of the $350 million in available revenues. So again, there's certainly debt capacity if it's signed. The current outstanding debt service is somewhere between $5 and $6 million a year, and the remaining 70% revenues will be 180, 190 million. So we're still talking 30 times coverage ratio, give or take, my math there. The final question is just longer term, how will future issuances be viewed? And did that also take into consideration the 6-year plan and the projects that are expected to be done where other bonding is anticipated? And then I guess the last question, and I'll shut up, is have the rating agencies made any comment or issued anything with regard to that? Madam Chair, Mr. Brown, the rating agencies have not made any comments. I expect if they are upset, they will start making comments sooner rather than later, is that they are aware of the legislative calendar down here. I do know an earlier version of the bill, when just the hotel tax was being repealed, and again, that was something that was worked on with the region, and they were supportive of taking one of the three taxes. As Mr. Garzinski noted, I think taking two of the three, the authorities had a slightly different reaction, and slightly is not the right word. They went from a positive reaction to a negative reaction. When we talked with the credit rating agencies about that, they were comfortable with the hotel tax. It was the smallest of the three taxes. Where it's generated had a closer relationship to what was owed to WMATA by the various jurisdictions and other things of that nature. And so I know they were comfortable with that. They have not said anything yet about the 15-cent grantor's tax, and I expect we'll hear that again if they have concerns in the coming weeks. And you also asked about the 6-year improvement plan. So the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, again, was funded with the 2013 revenue package. To date, they have only done 1- and 2-year capital programs. They were in the process of developing their first 6-year program, so they have not formally adopted one. This potential legislation certainly would have impacts on that plan were it to be signed as written. And I think the authority members, are, as Ms. Hines indicated, are going to be writing the governor, and I think they will be waiting to see what, if any, amendments come out before they continue forward with the development of that 6-year improvement program.
I would just note that there's been a call for projects. Most of them have been rated using the 599 process that hasn't been released yet to the public, but the hope had been by the end of June to adopt our first 6-year plan.
I will just say that, what Deputy Secretary Donahue is presenting today is the report that came out of the conference. Last month when we were with you, we presented the administration's bill that had changed from the introduced bill from Governor McAuliffe. We worked very closely with many, many stakeholders, including MVTA, to come up with a bill that I think most people called fair. The state, the region, and the localities, those that actually have WMATA, the MVTC, WMATA compact jurisdictions, all had skin in the game. And it included, I thought, very meaningful reforms. This particular bill, the good news, Mr. Kaspwitz, reflects the fact that you have a House and a Senate, as well as this administration, Republicans and Democrats, all recognizing that Metro needs and requires this kind of investment just to take care of its state of good repair needs. So that, I think, is a tremendous success. At this point, since session ended 10 days ago, last Saturday, and the conference report was signed, we are certainly taking input and opinions from many different stakeholders. I will tell you that there are moments when it's very hard to shift conversations because some people really love the conference report and some people really dislike this conference report. So we are just taking all of these things in. We're putting together some recommendations on what amendments could be. And I would say, as we work with the governor on what those possible amendments could be coming forward, I will also say working with our legislators, because regardless of what's put forward, we need their support as well. So I think building consensus with our legislators is also a very key component, as well as the business community and where they stand going forward. The $154 million, I think, is very important. We wanted to get to our full commitment to the $500,000. It is based on a formula that resides within the WMATA compact. We were advised by the Attorney General's office that following that formula would actually protect us should litigation ever be issued against this effort. The fact that we are taking money from a tax district and then using it for a system that goes beyond that jurisdiction. So we're trying to follow the formula, commit the $154 million, and do it in a way that is as fair as possible. So at this point, we're taking all of this in, Mr. Garzinski. We are listening, and we hope to put forward the best amendments that we can. Anything that you'd like to add, Director Mitchell?
I think that pretty much sums it up. There's still, we understand, we've heard a lot of the concerns. We're trying to figure out if any amendments.
I wish you all could be on some of the phone calls and in some of the meetings with us. But yes.
Yeah.
And it's certainly, as you had pointed out, it has been certainly a focus of our work in the first couple months.
And Madam Chair, before I move on to the other provision of this bill, because we're actually not done with this bill, and in case you're wondering, it amends, it's somewhere north of 30 or 35 code sections it amends or adds to the section of code. So this isn't your, two-page run-of-the-mill General Assembly legislation.
We're going to have one amendment for an enactment clause that referred back to the wrong code section. So I do know that.
Some things should be B and not D. I would just note, this was a team effort that was supporting the Secretary, Director Mitchell, and myself. We had the local governments, the business community. I mean, what you really saw was Northern Virginia come together and speak about the importance of WMATA, which is how you get a bill out of the House with a vote of 96-1 when there aren't more than 40 or 30 members from Northern Virginia. So I did just want to note, for those of you who helped us and are not here, and those of you who might be here and helped us, thank you, yes. Because it really was a team effort. I think some legislators said, are you really coming to talk to me about WMATA again? I've just had 5 meetings in the last hour about WMATA. And so there were a lot of folks in the Pocahontas building really working on this effort and helped get it across the finish line. So moving on to some of the other provisions of the bill. The bill does create another special non-reverting fund called the Commuter Rail Operating and Capital Fund. This fund may only be used for the Virginia Railway Express. It can be used for both operating and capital expenses. Capital expenses include, buying new rail cars, track improvements, as well as track acquisition. The amount of funding in there is $15 million a year. That comes from a mix of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission and the Potomac-Rappahannock Transportation Commission's gas tax floor revenues. Also, the VRE may sell bonds that are backed by this fund as long as the debt service does not exceed 66% of the anticipated revenues. As I mentioned, the funds come from those two commissions, and they're based on, again, what they would otherwise pay into VRE using their current subsidy formula. Of the new gas tax revenues, NVTC pays about $5 million, and PRTC pays approximately $10 million. And in PRTC, that leaves another $8 million that's available for other transportation improvements in those jurisdictions, which I know was a large subject of discussion there. I now want to move into the statewide mass transit components that are in the bill. This bill does not address the transit capital funding needs that we had talked about, and Director Mitchell worked with Mr. Williams on identifying. The original version of this bill did include provisions to address that. We heard from the Assembly that they were not comfortable with the mechanisms that were proposed to be used to address that, namely the sale of bonds. The concerns we heard were really twofold. The first was, this is a lot of debt capacity that you're proposing to use, and there are other projects that we may want to allocate that to. Two is maybe not right. There's 3 or 4 concerns. The other one was, what happens in year 5 after we sell 5 years worth of debt? Are we going to be right back here again? We'd really like to see a structural solution if we're going to address this, so that we don't have something we have to deal with every 5 years or whenever your bond authorization ends. There's also some concern that, are we using debt for assets that may or may not last for the term of the debt service? And I think the final one that you'll see kind of played out here in some of the reforms is, we just spent 4 years working on the allocation process for the construction programs, with smart scale and state of good repair. We should spend some time working on the transit programs and making sure that we have some similar reforms and can demonstrate efficiency in those. So the bill, unfortunately, does not address the transit capital needs, but it does include a whole host of reforms related to how the transit capital program works today, and gives this board a whole host of homework that the Assembly is asking you to complete in the next 10 months and have ready as you start to develop the 6-year program next year. Luckily, they didn't ask you to do it for the one in June, but they have given you a lot of things that they'd like you to do for next June. So the first piece of that, and this was discussed somewhat in the report Director Mitchell and Mr. Williams worked on, is it requires the implementation of a statewide prioritization process for the transit capital fund. The board is required by this bill to use this process for the update of the next 6-year program. So again, not this June, but the following one. It does allow for a separate process for state of good repair projects and minor expansion compared to major expansion projects. So recognizing that buying new buses versus kind of building a new light rail line, you might want to evaluate those projects differently. It does have that flexibility. The other major change that it makes to the state transit program is that it requires all state operating assistance for transit systems to be distributed using the TSDAC service delivery formulas. Some of you were here in 2013 when that process was put in place. At that time, it only applied to the new money, if you will, from the 2013 revenue bill. This proposal would extend that to all of the existing operating funds, and again, the board would be required to update the existing service delivery factors no later than July 1, 2019, so that would be in place for the FY 2025 6-year improvement program. I should note that with the changes in the statewide transit capital formula, this would not include WMATA. So this would include all transit systems in the Commonwealth, but would not include WMATA because they are given a fixed percentage that is just separate and apart from these processes. But again, the board is required to update the existing service factors as well as put in place a prioritization process essentially by the end of the calendar year. There are some additional requirements, and these apply to the transit agencies, but again, do have some ramifications for the board as well as the Department of Rail and Public Transportation. I think the main one is the requirement to develop guidelines for strategic plans, which any transit agency operating in an urban area with more than 20 buses would need to adopt or update at least every 5 years. DRPT is required to put in place guidelines subject to approval by this body that would go through a host of different areas that the Assembly would like these agencies to look at. So, an assessment of their state of good repair needs, a review of their existing routes and their performance, looking at, areas or opportunities, to improve service for underserved areas and other things of that nature. And so again, that's something else DRPT is going to be working on and bringing back to this board in the coming months, should the bill be signed. For your consideration in the coming years. One of the things we did work with the Assembly on is if people are required to do this every 5 years, we don't want everyone to be in a single year, have 4 years of really no updates, and then again another flood of, because I believe it's 15 or 16 agencies that this would apply to, and there are provisions in the bill that would allow the department to phase this requirement over time, so there would only be 3 or 4 agencies a year, which I think would make this more manageable, but also make it more helpful for the board, as you're not really drinking out of a fire hose. You can get 3 or 4 reports in a year, take a look at them, the next year see 3 or 4, take a look at those, and move on. So I do think that is we were able to work with the Assembly on that aspect. I did just want to kind of show you some of the things I know some of the members of the Assembly were talking about, and I don't expect that this is something you would see every transit agency do in their strategic plan, because this is really a kind of a drastic overhaul here, but I think for some agencies you may see them do this as a part of their strategic plan. The City of Richmond recently has undertaken a transit network plan where they have looked at and have revised their entire transit network. This revision to their network will go online when the Bus Rapid Transit on Broad Street opens. I typed in on their interactive map the address of this building, and if you were today to get on a bus with GRTC, this shows you where you could go in the City of Richmond in 15, 30, 45, or 60 minutes. As you can see, you can get a little bit outside of downtown in about 30 minutes, and then after that you can get to some parts of the city in 60 minutes, but you can't get to many places in really less than an hour. They have developed a new transit network plan that uses the same number of buses, the same number of drivers, and has the same operating cost by going in and looking at their routes, which they hadn't redesigned for a number of years, and now there's much greater portions of the city that one can access in 30 minutes or 45 minutes, really expanding access using the same number of resources. And I think these are some of the types of things the Assembly is going to be looking for from transit agencies in the coming years. I do want to stress, though, to manage expectations, this was not an insignificant undertaking on the part of the City of Richmond. It involved untold numbers of public hearings, a fair amount of resources to do this analysis and put this in place. So I think there's some transit agencies that might be ripe for this type of review, but this is not something we expect. This is not the level of review that we expect all transit agencies would do as they move forward with their strategic plans. So that completes the update on the WMATA Mass Transit Omnibus. Are there any questions on that before we move on to I-81?
I just do have one question. I thought that transit agencies had to do a transit development plan every 5 years. How is this different?
So the strategic plan would include some additional elements that are not currently covered by our transit development plan. What we plan to do is to actually use these and substitute these for the transit development plans, which we would no longer require, but we would take that guidance. And that's why the bill does give us some time to develop guidance and get some public comment on it as well before we roll that out. So. And I guess I will just add, we certainly embrace these reforms. We understand how important it is to get these in place as a matter of good practice, but also to demonstrate to the General Assembly that transit agencies across Virginia are utilizing state resources well. I don't want to minimize the amount of work that's going to go into some of these changes. It's going to be very significant on the behalf of the department, but also on the behalf of our grantees. And so we do plan to work very closely with them over the next year. Most of these changes do need to go into effect for the FY20 6-year plan. So what that means is that this body is going to have to approve a number of things before then. For the prioritization process for our capital program, we did a lot of that work in the Revenue Advisory Board, but it hasn't been finished. I'd say we got it probably about 75% of the way there, because that's all we needed to do at the time. So we are now working with the TISDAC and others to help us complete that prioritization process. When you back all of that up, we really need to have that approved by the CTB no later than October of 2018, which means we have to brief you on it in September. So that means a lot of work needs to get done by DRPT and TISDAC between now and September. And if you recall, we had 2 years to put the Smart Scale program in place. So we're doing a lot of that in a very short amount of time. So we will be bringing a number of presentations to the CTB and I will ask for your tolerance, just like Nick had to stand up there for a lot of time to brief you on some of these, the prioritization process. I'll be doing somewhat of the same thing too. So I think next month we plan to bring back a presentation to get you all started on understanding that. The other aspect of this is the allocating formula for the operating funds. We have a little bit more time with that because we don't have the same kind of application process we do with our capital funds. But I think we will need the CTB to approve that really no later than February of 2019 so that we can get it in place in time for the 6-year plan. And so, again, backing up, that means we have to have something by January. So anyway, I just wanted to note for you all that this is going to be a big level of effort for this group as well, that we'll really be looking, because at the end of the day, the CTB has to approve the policies. And so we will be bringing a lot back to you on that. So.
Thank you. Okay, I know you're not done yet.
I'm not. We have 2 more bills to go through, much shorter. So that bill was, I think, 25 pages in total, and these 2 put together are 8. So I do want to talk a little bit about these. I think they're important bills, even though they're short. The first one is Senate Bill 971, which was sponsored by Senators Obenshain and Senator Carrico. This is a bill that directs this body to develop an I-81 and corridor improvement plan. And really, it kind of goes through a host of issues here, but one directs you to look at the entire length of I-81, identify kind of key segments, and then within each segment identify targeted improvements that could be implemented in there. I think some of the discussion as this bill was being developed is this is not Star Solutions 2.0. And for those of you who don't remember Star Solutions, that was add 2 lanes in each direction the whole way, maybe make them truck only, maybe not, and let's toll everyone. And they were pretty clear that that was not the type of thoughtful process they were looking for. They wanted us to really drill down, look at targeted, pragmatic, implementable, types of solutions. They also did direct this body to look at toll financing options that could help fund these improvements. The bill is specific that it does not want you to evaluate any type of tolling regime that would toll all vehicles using I-81. However, it does say that it would like you to evaluate truck-only tolls or tolls on heavy commercial vehicles and the potential use of express lane tolls on any parts of I-81. So those are really kind of, I think, the two main components of that. There are then some additional components related to the evaluation of truck-only tolls, which is really saying, please look at, any impacts of diversion of trucks off of 81 onto local routes and impacts that may have on communities along the 81 corridor. And the other aspect is saying, please look at whether or not there are strategies or options to minimize the impact of the imposition of any potential truck toll on 81 on local trucks. I do want to remind this body that we did study truck usage on I-81 in excruciating detail during the Kane administration. And what we found at that time was somewhere north of 60% of the trucks that use I-81 start and end their trips somewhere outside of Virginia, which said differently means 60% of all those trucks on I-81 are just passing through. And so I think that was one of the reasons you saw the Assembly look at this potential way, is we have a lot of people driving through Virginia, is creating a very significant impact on this key corridor for the people who use it on a regular basis. I think the other thing is we are asked to look at whether or not there are any potential economic impacts on manufacturing, agricultural, or other industries along that corridor. We are working to try and put together a draft timeline for this plan that we would bring back to this board next month, but it is something that I think will be a big focus for the board, along with the transit reforms that Director Mitchell just finished talking about, as one of what are we going to be dealing with over the coming year. I think we can put this right up there with those transit reforms. I know Secretary Valentine was very happy to see the legislatures take a look at I-81. We were pleased to see the healthy margins by which this bill passed, but this is going to be a big effort moving forward. And I do want to say, looking at truck tolls is going to require a lot of engagement and discussion with that industry and others in that corridor, and I do expect it at times may be loud.
Thank you, Nick. Was there any discussion about rail on the 81 corridor?
Madam Chair, Mr. Connors, I think what the plan asks us to do, and asks really this body to do, is identify improvements that can improve travel on the 81 corridor, that could improve upgrades to Route 11, technology improvements, and potentially rail improvements. I think that are some of the things that this body needs to look at in the coming months as we look at developing the corridor improvement plan.
Thank you.
Other comments? I will say that regardless of what we learn from this, we have to take it back. Go through this board. We'll go back to the General Assembly. There's legislation in place. It doesn't exactly prohibit this, but it requires us to go back to the General Assembly. So it would have another cycle through the General Assembly before anything would actually be decided. But the corridor is so important. 42% of all the interstate truck traffic goes down 81. 25% of all accidents involve a truck. So certainly the reliability issue. And as we have stakeholders at the table, as I mentioned to you last month, one of our main focuses is to make sure we're improving 81 for the trucking industry. That we have the right ramps in place, we have lighting, we have parking, we have rest stops along the corridor as well. So we really are inviting everyone to be a part of this. And certainly rail, Norfolk Southern runs parallel to 81 all the way down the corridor. So again, another option for us in looking at it. And I think the commissioners already started looking at kind of beginning some of the preliminary work for us on this particular project.
Approximately a month ago, we started looking at what I'll term, if money fell out of the sky tomorrow, where would we put it and why? So we've already got a leg up in looking at it, looking at scalable size projects, so that depending on if tolling is a solution or if additional funds or resources come in, be able to match the size of the project to the location that is needed first, and then scale that back to the available funding limit.
And it was one of the projects we submitted for an infra grant, correct?
I was going to mention that. So just a quick reminder for the board, we have 2 pending grants before the United States Department of Transportation. One is for, I believe, $50 or $60 million to combine with other projects going on in I-81 to, I believe, make a host of improvements in the Roanoke area. And the other is for several $100 million to help with the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel expansion, as well as the express lanes network down there. Secretary Child's staff, in the call with Secretary Valentine and myself, has said they hope to have award information in June regarding who might get some of those funds. Just to remind you all, while we were very successful in round 1 and received 21% of the money nationwide, I don't think that's going to happen again. The good news is there's more money this time, so there's $1.7 billion rather than $800 million available for award. But again, it is a very, very competitive grant program, and there's several $1 billion in requests for the 1.7 that's available.
I will say that Deputy Secretary and I were invited to be on a phone call with USDOT this week, and we thought perhaps we had won. That was not the subject of the call.
Secretary?
Yes, sir.
Nick, are the awards based on an objective point system? Or
Madam Secretary, Mr. Garzinski, I would say there are certainly criteria that are outlined in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is what they call their grant applications. I would say we do not receive a scorecard like you do on Smart Scale, where we can compare ourselves to all of the projects in the Commonwealth, but there certainly are criteria that are used to evaluate projects. And we have met with staff there to have discussions to make sure that we understood, as Virginia, what the federal government was looking for in their applications. So the final bill that I'd like to mention was House Bill 765, carried by Delegate Jones. It passed unanimously in the Senate and by a wide margin in the House. This bill really codifies some of the practices the board has put in place over the past few years. So one of the things it does is it codifies the board policy that any smart scale or state of good repair project added to the 6-year program must be fully funded. Again, that was a policy you all as a body had put in place. They say imitation is the greatest form of flattery, and the Assembly apparently likes what you're doing, and they're now putting it into the law. They also did take some of the revenue sharing program modifications that the board made. They capped local governments at $5 million a year rather than the $10 million that had previously been in law. Again, you all lowered that cap about 7 or 8 months ago. It also does provide $100 million a year for the revenue sharing program, or 7% of the overall program, whichever is greater. So again, I know Mr. Whitworth, one of the things you mentioned on a repeated basis, well, if Smart Scale grows to a certain amount, we also want to make sure revenue sharing grows into the future. And so the Assembly did take that into account and added that to the law as well here. It does also update the appointment requirements for the board. So as you all know, there are 5 at-large members on this body. 2 are required to be from rural areas, 2 are required to be from urban, and 1 can be from either. And urban and rural were defined as any area under 50,000 was considered rural, and any area over that was considered urban. That was put in place in 1986. At that time, Abingdon, Stanton, Harrisonburg, and Winchester were all considered rural areas. Over the last 25, 30 years, that has changed. And so the legislature updated those requirements and now said urban is anything over 200,000 and rural is anything under that, which just provides some additional flexibility there as we look for additional members for this body in the future. And then they do add new reporting requirements and update the existing reporting requirements, both for the Intermodal Office and for the Department of Transportation, really focusing on, how is the department using the Highway Maintenance and Operating Program, and how is the board allocating the Smart Scale funds, the Virginia Transportation Infrastructure Bank funds, and other programs under its control. So I'd really, put that as more transparency types of items and some of the things we've talked about with this board. And that, Madam Secretary, completes my presentation.
So soon.
It's one of the shorter ones.
Any questions, thoughts, suggestions, concerns?
If I could just note, this is, again, the 3rd year in a row where we've essentially had no earmarks in the budget. I think that is a testament and a credit to this body and the work you're doing. So as one of the people who has to go in the General Assembly building and have discussions with all the stakeholders and legislators, people really do recognize the work you all have done and are complimentary of that, and I think that's something you guys should know and hear, and you can see it in the budget proposals that are in both the House and the Senate. If you would have looked 7 or 8 years ago, you would have seen a whole host of, earmarks or take money here or do this. You're not seeing that. Instead, they're actually saying, hey, board, please develop a policy. Here's some things we think you should think about, rather than dictating exactly what they want done, and that's really a sea change from how the Assembly used to act with the transportation agencies. And again, I think it's the work that this body's done.
We'll also say what great work you do as well. So, okay, thank you.
Joanne.
Now there's Joanne Maxwell. How are you?
I'm fine, Madam Chair,
We
members
usually
of the
just
board.
pass each other.
I know, we've been like strangers in the night.
Yeah.
Madam Chair, members of the board, you have in front of you a handout that is approximately 23, 24 pages that just very briefly highlight some of the bills that may be of more interest to the board, whether they're VDOT or DRPT bills. I would just want to highlight a couple of the bills, certainly not to the level of detail that Nick has. But the first bill that you will see is on page 1 of this report. The report's entitled CTB Status Report. And let me say, first of all the bills that I talk about are bills that have been, with the exception of one, that were passed by both houses and are at the governor's office now. So they still await governor's action. First bill is a bill that was introduced very late in the session and that you all may not be aware of. There would not have been prior discussions about this bill. This bill is intended to address a constitutional challenge to a very important statute that prohibits individuals from putting signs in the right-of-way. And that same statute also gives VDOT the authority to remove illegal signs in the right-of-way. That's under constitutional attack, and we are attempting to remedy or address some issues that have been pointed out by the judge in that case. So again, that has passed both houses and is now awaiting action by the governor. The next item that is of interest, and I'm skipping over Nick's items, HB 712, this was a VDOT bill that would have basically put the law, the CTB naming statute, back in the posture that it was back in 2012 before legislation was enacted that would have authorized the CTB to name transportation facilities for living individuals based for a fee. That bill has not survived. It made it through it made it through House, and when it came over to Senate, it made it through Senate Transportation, and once it got to the Senate floor, it was pulled back for reasons that are not quite clear to us, but nevertheless, the bill is not going to be enacted this year. And as a result, there may be some action that the CTB is going to need to take in the ensuing months. So we will keep you apprised. Another bill is HB 1275. That's another VDOT bill. That's a FOIA bill that basically is just giving entities that are subject to audit by VDOT, private entities, the ability or the protection of, or provides a FOIA exemption that would allow VDOT to withhold certain trade secrets and proprietary information from release under FOIA. So that's going to be important for the agency and its effectiveness in conducting audits. HB 1285 on page 6 is a bill that basically would require this body, this board, the NVTA, the NVTC, and the Virginia Railway Express to conduct a joint meeting once a year for the purpose of presenting projects that are in each of these entities' plans, and to receive public comment on those projects. The bill does not require the full board to be there, but just one representative of each of the entities. If you, HB 1525, just for informational purposes, this is, that's on page 8. This is a bill that would prohibit or provides higher penalties for individuals that are texting or emailing on their cell phones while in VDOT work zones. So we feel like this may be a movement towards more enhanced safety in the work zones. On page 9 is HB 662, which would require VDOT to prepare a report and study what needs to be done in the event that Maryland enacts a plan for remediation of the American Legion Bridge. On page 10 is, you'll find HB 1522 and SB 905. That is legislation that would prohibit VDOT from commercializing rest areas on the interstates unless the General Assembly first approves. So just to note that to the extent, I think this bill generated from, there were reports that the President's infrastructure plan may have provided or might provide for commercialization of rest areas, and there were some concerns on the part of private entities that operate along the interstates, concerns that that might somehow hinder their ability to compete. Just one or two more. Overweight vehicles on page 16, HB 1276 and SB 504. This legislation will basically direct the VDOT to convene a working group that would examine the impacts of vehicles of any federal pilot program or federal authorization for vehicles weighing 91,000 pounds to operate on the interstate. VDOT will be required to convene a working group of various stakeholders. This was proved to be very controversial during the session, and so at this point we are just looking to study the potential implications of that. And then finally, on page 19 of your handout, HB 1427 and SB 823 basically have put into law now fees, or would put into laws, fees that must be paid by private entities, those entities that provide wireless service. The fees that they would have to pay in order to establish infrastructure, the support structures for wireless services. So again, all of the bills I've talked about have not yet been acted upon by the governor, but nevertheless we wanted to give you a sense of what is out there and what has at least passed both houses. Madam Chair?
Any questions? On the HB 1427, is that the one you were just referring to?
On the overweight or the
wireless?
The wireless, yes. Yes, ma'am.
So, but there was a working group that helped arrive at some of these decisions, because when I first read it, I was concerned about it, but there was a group that was convened, and these were the recommendations that came from the task force.
There was a working group that was convened that looked at the working group that was ultimately convened and worked all last summer, looked primarily at zoning issues, zoning as it pertained to locality and placement of this infrastructure in the right-of-ways and in localities. The working group was supposed to look at the fees, the right-of-way fees, but they never actually got to it. So they, for various reasons, they did not. This was a concept that had been floated around or had been, I think, floated in legislation year prior, but it ended up being taken out of the legislation. So it's, but yes, there definitely was a working group that has worked for several years now on the concept of wireless and right-of-ways and placement of wireless in the right-of-ways.
Madam Chair?
Might be, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Oh, that's okay. I just wanted to point out there was an article in the Washington Post, I think this morning, it may have been yesterday, talking about this particular issue. There's a lot of concern, not for VDOT, but localities, that this would allow, in places where power lines have been undergrounded, for these companies to come in and put poles in under 50 feet with little cell things on top, plus whatever the support cabinet is. So I would say this is causing some consternation outside of our realm, but anyway, I think we'll get some pushback there.
Yes, and it also could affect, the underground wiring task force that you're putting together, Mr. Commissioner. And I was also thinking that it might be really great for Joanne Maxwell to come to the technology meeting to get an update on some of the work being done there, so you could see how we're working with fiber and trying to figure out what we have in the Commonwealth as these kinds of bills come forward.
Understood, and I will be happy to attend.
Yes.
I have one question about SB 583 and about kind of how that was received. It's the Western Virginia Commission for Western Virginia Transportation.
Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, I don't believe there was a lot of controversy with regard to this legislation. I don't know offhand what the voting record was, but
I mean, Madam Secretary, Mr. Brown's asking about Senator Hanger's bill, Senate Bill 583, which would have modeled a similar but slightly different concept of the regional authorities you have in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads along the 81 corridor and other parts of Western Virginia by imposing a 2.1% additional tax on the sale of fuel at the retail level, which again is the same tax we talked about with the price floor earlier. The bill was generated around $70 to $80 million a year for upgrades to the 81 corridor. It passed the Senate 26-14, and I believe was left in a House Finance Subcommittee at the request of the patron. And so what that tells me is the bill had the support in the Senate, and they had a lot of work still to do in the House. Now it was carried over, and so it will still be before the House Finance Committee at the start of the next session if they act in between now and the beginning of the following session. But I think that says something. And Madam Secretary, I was remiss, and one thing I just should have noted, there were, I believe, 8 bills that dealt with Interstate 66 inside the Beltway and the tolling that is in place there. None of those bills moved forward out of the chamber in which they were introduced. It was a wide subject of discussion, and I do expect that we will continue to hear from those lawmakers, but I did want to note, because I mentioned that in my previous update 2 months ago, that there were several pieces of legislation. Again, none of those did move forward. Madam Secretary talked with many of the legislators there and talked about some of the things she plans to do in the coming months. And we, strongly advocated that they not legislate changes, because if you tell us to do a specific thing and then we do it and you don't like the outcome, well, it's the law until you come back. And so we were glad to see that none of those bills advanced.
That was the other half of what we did this session. So, okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What are all these people doing here? How did y'all get here? Welcome. As I'm sure you know, we are planning on a special visitor this afternoon, and I just welcome you all to the Commonwealth Transportation Board. We're just going to go ahead and continue until the governor arrives, and when he does, we'll just go ahead and rise and welcome him. But for those of you I haven't met, I'm Shannon Valentine. These are the Commonwealth Transportation Board members, and we hope that this will not be the first time that you will come and meet with us and visit with us. We don't always have special guests, but we're very happy to have you, so thank you. All right, let me see. Next, is John Lawson here? Mr. Lawson, would you like to go into the financials before the governor arrives?
Certainly. Good afternoon, Madam Secretary, Commissioner, Director, members of the board. Last month, I gave a brief presentation on the kind of the updates of the preliminary outlook for the 6-year update. I indicated I would come back to you this month with results from the General Assembly and the impacts. As you have heard from Deputy Secretary Donahue, the legislation adjourned without a budget, and there's still some pending legislative items. So I have a very brief update for you today. As I mentioned, there are several unresolved items that will potentially impact the transportation programs and the funding as we look forward. Fortunately, this is not a smart scale year, so we're not really under the pressures of getting numbers in place to be able to move forward. So we can finalize those numbers once the budget is passed. So what we will be doing now is moving forward with the development of the 6-year improvement program based on the preliminary funding that I presented to you last month. But I do want to point out to you just some of the pending items that we will be monitoring, and as the budget is resolved, we'll come back to you and explain the potential or the actual impacts. Few items related to the budget. Both budgets that passed the Senate and the House have plans for employee either bonuses and/or raises and/or increases in health insurance premiums from the employer contribution side. The two proposals don't agree, so they will have to be ironed out. So both of these are still in play. The potential impact range from VDOT perspective from about $7 million to about $27 million a year in terms of agency cost. There was one budget amendment on the House side that doesn't cost the department any funding, but I just want to bring it to your attention. The amendment directs $3 million out of the City of Virginia Beach's urban payment to be used for the development of a sound wall along Highway 13. So that's just an item that is in the budget, and to my understanding, the city was objected to. In the Senate's version of the budget, there's an item that provides $750,000 to each of the years of the budget, 19 and 20, for a study of the Chincoteague Island, or actually the tributaries around the Chincoteague Island study, to be done by the space flight. There was an amendment for maintenance payment adjustment. We've had some discussion before the board over the past few months about some questions around the reduction in Henrico's, or perceived reduction in Henrico's payment as it related to the adjustment of mileage in Arlington County. And what the Senate amendment does is it takes about $400,000 each year out of the access programs and moves it into to pay Henrico County. And then the last one I want to bring to your attention is an adjustment of about $2.6 million of revenue that would be taken out of the HMO revenues and added to or provided to the Virginia Water Quality Improvement Fund. You may recall that about $7.5 million a year today comes out of transportation dollars for the Chesapeake Bay initiatives, which was started many years ago. The payment was intended to represent funds or taxes collected on gasoline sales related to marine applications. And this additional component here was moved forward as really as an adjustment to that $7.5 million, because it has not remained constant for so long. The only piece of legislation that I want to bring to your attention is the same one Mr. Donahue went over in great detail. There are two components of SB 856 and HB 1539 that have potential impacts to the transportation program. The first, as mentioned, the $10 million a year roughly of the rental tax that is currently dedicated to the State of Good Repair will be redirected to the Washington Metropolitan Area Transportation Authority Capital Fund. And then as related to the recordation taxes that he referenced, it's about $20 million a year annually out of the Northern Virginia Transportation District Fund, and program would be also provided to that area. So based on where we are today, we are moving forward with the update and the draft for the 19 through 24 program. And just so, but because this is the first time we've had a cycle without a smart scale application, just wanted you to be aware of what is actually being undertaken. There will be in the draft distribution of State of Good Repair program funds. We are working with the MPOs on the RSTP or the Regional Surface Transportation Program and Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Programs. Through the portal, we are accepting applications and looking at the distribution of funds for the Highway Safety Improvement Program, the Revenue Sharing Program, as Ms. Brown talks about a lot, and the Transportation Alternatives Program. As we look at smart scale updates, again, the portal is open for consideration for applications. Preliminary applications are due by June 1st. The final applications are due by August the 1st. But in the meantime, as part of this update, we'll be reviewing existing projects to identify potential surpluses that may have been generated through the awards, and reserving those funds to be contributed toward the amounts that will be available for round 3. So moving forward, we do plan to present to you next month the draft six-year improvement program. We have public hearings scheduled during the months of April and May, and then we'll be back to adopt the final in June. And as I mentioned, the SMART portal is open for applications as we speak. And I'm sure you've seen the schedules, but this is our travel plan, travel itinerary for April and May that will have us moving across the state, hearing the public as they comment on the draft six-year improvement program. Madam Secretary, that's all I have to present today.
Sir. The 6th. You know, I'm really not sure. I know that they
vary, as you well know.
Yes. 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 But that's okay. She's smiling. Yeah.
Screwed up. Put it on my calendar.
No, and I'm not sure with how far ahead we advertise it and how much flexibility there is. So we'll see. We'll work offline.
This is a big problem.
Yes, of course. Of course, of course. So we'll try to work that. So when are you going to resolve the budget, Mr. Lawson?
Well, either fortunately or unfortunately, it's not mine to resolve.
I've been saying that as well.
Exactly.
So, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
8. Is Secretary Secretary Elliott in the room? Okay. Because Mr. Bishop, I think you and Quentin Elliott were going to do a safety proposal next. Is that okay? Yes. It's nice to see you. Welcome. I've not heard your specific presentation in this area, but I hear you're quite good and very knowledgeable in this area. Yes. Somebody else is going to have to guard the back door. Mr. Donahue had requested, since he gave such a lengthy legislative update, that he have a break. So, which is why we're going to ask Deputy Secretary Elliott to come in. I would ask for an update from the Rail and Technology Committees, but it would take way too long.
Way too long.
I know.
Far too
Yes, sir.
complicated.
Secretary, I can give a quick update on the orientation guide if you need.
Oh, that'd be great.
Just as you may remember from the beginning of the year, Secretary asked us to put together a committee which consists of Mary Hines, Greg Yates, and Dixon Whitworth, and myself chairing, to produce before July 1, which is potentially a transition time for this board in several spots, a new director or new member orientation program.
That was quick. Thank you very much, Gary.
And that was the perfect length of time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hello, welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the 73rd Governor of Virginia, His Excellency, Ralph S. Northam. So welcome.
What a welcoming.
Yes, I will tell you, this is the Commonwealth Transportation Board. This is the board that has transformed transportation decisions and identifying funding and completing projects. You and I have laughed. We actually have a 6-year plan. And with us, we have the business community and some of our folks upstairs in VDOT and downstairs in VDOT who actually came up to also extend their greetings to you.
I don't know which way to speak. I'll go,
would you like my seat?
No, because I'm not going to stay here very long. But, I'll go side too. How about that? But no, thank you. First of all, to Shannon, thank you for your service. You know, we've only been on the ground for a couple months now, but I think you all have done some just amazing work. So thank you for your service to the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I know we have Quentin and Nick with us here today as well, and appreciate all that you all are doing. And to the board, I know this is tough work, but it's important work, and I appreciate your all's service to the Commonwealth of Virginia. And just a couple comments I would make. I was in the Senate for 6 years, and then LG for 4, and I watched and participated in the transportation plan of 2013, and say this, but I don't follow directions very well. But anyway, congratulations.
Best road deal in North America.
Yes, and I also just a couple other things, and then I will leave you all to your business. But it was a real priority this year for the legislature to work together again in a bipartisan way and find a dedicated source of revenue for Metro. It is vitally important to this Commonwealth, and so I'm proud that Virginia took the lead on that, and we have legislation that will provide $154 million a year. And again, thank you all for for your leadership in doing that. And then also very excited about I-81. This a tremendously important interstate that goes through Virginia, and the truck traffic, all of the things that are going on, we really need to address that. So you've done good work. You have a lot of important work to do in the future, and I just thank you all for your service, and I look forward to leading over the next 4 years. So thank you very much. Please be seated. If nothing else, you all get to stretch your legs when I come in.
You can tell how happy we are to have, I was going to say interruption. No, we're so happy to have a guest here in the afternoon. I didn't know, do you have time for one or two questions?
Absolutely. If anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to address those.
Of course, I say that now. At our last, I had mentioned at the last CTB meeting that I was able to join you up at the White House for the infrastructure rollout of the principles, and we went to the National Governors Association meeting on infrastructure. And I just thought maybe perhaps you might want to share some of your thoughts about being up there and, having the emphasis being put on what could be so important to this group.
Well, we were up there, and our president rolled out his infrastructure plan. I think it's somewhat maybe lacking in details right now, but I think the initiative is good. And so, as you know, when we were up there, we talked about several things that we thought the federal government could help us with. One of them is I-81, but the other one that's also very important to the Commonwealth is our port. And I think our president was actually fairly enthusiastic when I told him that it was important that we dredge our harbors dredge our channels rather to 55 feet and widen our channels so that we could accommodate the larger ships that are coming out of the Panama Canal. So I think we were well received there, and again, I think there are a lot of details that need to be talked about as far as their plan, but anything that we can do, working with Washington to bring federal money into the Commonwealth of Virginia, I think will be in our best interest. So I look forward to that.
We were just talking about federal grants right before you had walked in, and we had 81. It was one of the projects that we had actually put forward. So anything else? Do you have a bracket alive?
Well, unfortunately for the Commonwealth of Virginia, VMI was not in the bracket. So here we are.
Well, no, I won't even go there. Yes, it was very tough. I went to UVA.
Yeah.
So it was all very tough.
I will let you all get back to your work, but thank you for letting me stop by and keep up the good work. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
I know that you all are going to be scooting out of this room, but if anyone here has any questions or anything they'd like to ask, you are. Look how anxious they are.
I think he's a very man.
Y'all, thank you for coming. Mr. Elliott, it's not you that they just left.
Different tone. In this
The room cleared out.
But he's right. I don't think that tone helps a lot.
Because we are all very excited to hear your presentation. Did Mr. Bishop leave too? No.
All right. Yeah, hard act to follow. So Nick was lucky he got to go before the governor. I have to go after the governor, and so not sure what y'all can expect.
Planned it, of course.
Yeah, yes, he did. All right. Ready?
Ready.
All right. Madam Secretary, members of the board, start off with, I want to say 3 words: safety, security, and resilience. These 3 words are going to be key to how we go about developing, operating, and maintaining our infrastructure in Virginia. And so last month, you heard me talk about our safety and our safety initiatives. And since then, just Friday, we had another worker that was struck and injured on Interstate 85. The individual was hit by a vehicle pinned against a guardrail. He was doing guardrail repair, ended up breaking 2 of his legs, breaking his back, breaking several ribs. The individual, I believe today or yesterday, just was brought out of intensive care, so he's on the road to recovery after several surgeries. So again, what I want to do is spend a little time, again, talking about the importance of safety on our roadway and our roadway transportation infrastructures. Let me make sure I can run this thing. Last month, you heard me use the number 843. 843 is how many people lost their lives in 2017 on our roadways. Another number I want you to recognize that there were 127,000 accidents on our roadways last year. 127,000 accidents. 843 of those led to fatalities. 1 fatality on our roadway is too much. This is intolerable, and we've got to do something to begin to correct that. 248 of those fatalities were the result of alcohol. Again, these numbers are less when you look back towards the 80s when I was growing up, but they are still too high, and we've got to continue to work on improving those. There were over 7,000 accidents that were related to alcohol last year. Again, 248 fatalities. There were 208 fatalities related to distracted driving. That's pretty significant. I'm going to go back to 248 alcohol-related, 208 related to distracted driving. Distracted driving is becoming a serious epidemic as it relates to safety on our roadways. And these are the 208 are only the numbers that they could identify. As we know, that number is probably much higher. So distracted driving has become just as dangerous as drinking and driving in the Commonwealth. And we need to do something different about that. The number 12, that's how many fatalities occurred in our work zones. And we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to make our work zone safe for the users and those workers who are working on our roadways. Just this year, you had heard me talk about, we had early on in February, we had one of our employees was struck by a tractor trailer in his crash cushion. Then I made you aware of the fatality involving one of our contract workers. And again, we had the incident that occurred Friday. This is becoming very serious, and that's why, again, you heard me talk about safety. Safety has to be part of what we do and what we look at as we move forward with our transportation infrastructure. We cannot afford to ignore it going forward. Our goal is 0 fatalities. That's what we want to see, is 0 fatalities. And as I mentioned last month, the first thing we've got to do is stop the upward trend, stop that, and then begin to move in the opposite direction towards 0. And in order to do that, at your desk, you have a calendar, and you probably wondered what that calendar was. That calendar is the beginning of the things that we want to start working on moving forward as it relates to safety. In the month of April, and what we're doing is we're partnering with Public Safety and Homeland Security, including Virginia State Police, DMV, and we plan to bring in as many other secretariats and organizations on this, but we didn't want to wait too long to begin to do something. And so this calendar is showing you, and what I challenge everyone with is, let's find some activity that's going to occur every day throughout the month of April that focuses on safety. And what you see up there is each week we've picked a different area to focus on. The first week, we call it 2 wheels and 2 legs. And so what we want to do in the first week is focus on pedestrian safety, bicycle safety, and motorcycle safety. And we've got events planned, media spots and outreach that we plan on doing during that week. The second week is focused on work zone safety, again, looking at what we can do to improve our work zones. And we have the vigil that will be held up on Afton Mountain at our Workers' Memorial during that month. And again, if you have an opportunity to be there, I'd encourage you to show up. The third week is going to be focused on distracted driving. Again, we want to have some major outreach, and you're going to hear a little bit more about some of the things that we plan on doing during that month from Deputy Commissioner of DMV, George Bishop, who will go into some things that they're doing as it relates to distracted driving. And from that, we'll talk about some of the things that VDOT's going to be doing to partner with them to use our variable message signs to, again, reach out to the public and let them know what's going on. You know, we have a captive audience on our roadways. Again, we don't want to distract them, but we do want to get that message across. And then the final week is going to be about changing the culture in the vehicle. And what we mean about changing the culture of inside the vehicle is State Police is going to be working to help change that culture, focusing on making sure folks are wearing their seat belts. They're going to be looking at speeding and other things during that week, working with local law enforcement in addition. So again, we cannot continue to wait. We've got to do something, and this is the beginning of that. Now, what I'd like to do is ask Commissioner Britch, if he's got some other things that he would like to point out, his goals and objectives going forward as it relates to safety. Commissioner?
Members of the committee, Madam Secretary, as Quentin outlined, work zone safety is paramount, or safety in VDOT is number one, and I mean that truly. You're going to hear it quite often. It's just not a thing that we say or a slogan. It is truly our number one priority. One of the things that the Deputy Secretary Elliott had mentioned with the statistics, we've had 14,500 crashes here in Virginia through the end of February. That's in just 2 months worth of time. 187 of those crashes occurred in work zones. That resulted in 88 injuries and 1 fatality. And I'm here to tell you that I've gotten notifications when I came on board for executive notifications of work zone equipment being hit at all hours of the night. About a month ago, as Quentin said, that we had an incident with a pothole patching repair operation down on Route 58 outside of Cape Ron, where a tractor trailer avoided the first crash cushion truck, swerved into the operation, and pushed the second crash cushion truck into the pothole patching dump truck. Overturned and had to be extricated out of the cab of the vehicle and medevaced here to MCV. Now the good news is our VDOT employee, before Rob Carey and I could even get over to MCV, he was already being discharged. That's the good news. The unfortunate thing is that happened on a Tuesday or Wednesday. That Saturday was when the fatality occurred on another pothole patching operation on I-95, where one of our contract employers was killed. Just this past weekend, or Friday afternoon on the way home, I got the third call of another operation that took place. Again, Quentin described it very well. The common theme in all of this has been distracted driving, reaching for a cell phone. This latest one that happened Friday, it appears that the driver of the vehicle dropped her cell phone and went to pick it up. The other two, the preliminary reports are indicating the same thing. Coming out of this, we are going to use the task force that Quentin has assembled, but we're going to add industry representatives to it to be able to address specifically work zone safety and what can we do with distracted driving in and around the work zones. As Quentin said, one death is too many. I don't want to receive the calls anymore. I don't want those calls, and I'll tell you, I don't think industry wants the calls either. If we don't make our work zone safe, industry may not come and work here for us. So this is on us to be able to take the charge. Distracted driving is going to be a key to this. I think we do have an epidemic on our hands. 208 is rival with going back to the drinking and driving issue. The unfortunate thing with distracted driving is that it's a self-reporting mechanism, not a true indicator. So those numbers could be double what they are in reality. But I want to make first and foremost that our work zones are safe for our people and our contract workers. So in the coming months, you'll see some changes, I think, and maybe some additional reporting back to the board for what we are doing within work zone safety and distracted driving initiatives.
Thank you, Steve. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask the two deputy commissioners, the one from DMV and from VDOT, to stand, and then I'd like to turn the mic over to Deputy Commissioner George Bishop, who will talk about some things that they are doing with distracted driving during the month of April. So with that.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Let's see if I make sure I know how this thing works. Okay. Madam Secretary.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, members of the board. I'm thrilled to be here today to speak to you, and I'm very. And I want to let you know I'm from DMV and from those in the highway safety community. I do want to just take a moment to thank you and your members of this administration and the other highway safety partner agencies within transportation for the remarkable job so far in really putting safety as an important part of what this administration is about. And we at DMV, as Deputy Commissioner of DMV, I also serve as the Virginia Highway Safety Coordinator. And I just want to thank you for the focus that this administration is putting on safety and for the efforts of Deputy Secretary Elliott in putting together this working group. I am here to talk to you about highway safety in general but distracted driving in particular. And one particular effort that is underway in Virginia. But before I do, as you heard, 208 people tragically lost their lives as a result of distracted driving in Virginia last year. And the numbers of crashes involving distracted driving was 15,000. 26,000 and 15,000 injuries. So 208 deaths, but 15,000 injuries and 26,000 crashes. And as as the commissioner indicated, many of those are self-reported because there is no way for us to tell. As I like to say, there's no standardized field sobriety test for distracted driving. So unfortunately, the fatalities from distracted driving are headed in the wrong direction. As the Deputy Secretary pointed out, they are beginning to rival, and I'm afraid that at some point, maybe even in this administration, will begin to surpass those of alcohol-related fatalities unless we do something, and we do something soon. It is certainly an epidemic, and we definitely need to do something soon. And awareness of the issue really is one way that one small way that we're trying to combat distracted driving, trying to hammer home really just how dangerous our actions are behind the wheel, create sort of a social norming, if you will, that makes it really intolerable and not accepted in the community. Of course, we're really fighting against a very strong impulse, which is that impulse to pick up that phone, because really the world, the information that you can get out of that phone is just tremendous, and so we're fighting against a very strong impulse, but trying to create the awareness that we need to make it unacceptable to use your phone while you're driving. And one creative way that we came up with was this license plate design contest, which is called Take Action Against Distraction. So the purpose of the contest really is for us to give Virginia high school students the ability to design a license plate that is in support of distraction-free driving. The initiative really is the result of legislation from the 2017 session. It was introduced by former Delegate Tag Greason that authorizes the Commissioner of DMV to issue license plates that support highway safety in general, but specifically mention distracted driving. Now, we had some success in the past in using license plate design competitions, and so we came up with this idea to use high school students as a way to get them to generate discussion amongst themselves and in the community about the issue of distraction. And of course, as you probably are aware, they are a particularly at-risk segment of the driving public. So we launched in November of 2017, we launched this distracted driving license plate design contest and received more than 200 designs from students all over the Commonwealth by the December deadline. Now, DMV is sort of segmented into 8 districts, not unlike how VDOT does it, and each of our districts then served as the basis of determining one of 8 finalists. So we put together a panel of judges in each of the 8 districts. We had some very distinguished members of the public, such as, for example, Chris Long, 2-time Super Bowl champion and UVA graduate. Wahoo!
We want to bring that up.
Tom Dolan, who's a 2-time Olympic gold medalist in swimming. Several artists, members of the local media, law enforcement, and our safety partners who served and were very, as they were really into this campaign, and they were great. They served a great purpose, and they truly had some great discussions in judging these submissions. They met in January, and our regional finalists were announced February 7th, and the public began online voting to determine the ultimate winner on February 20th. And that voting concludes actually tonight at midnight, or 11:59.
So we can still vote.
So I noticed that everyone has a computer in front of them. And you can go to www.dmvnow.com and you can vote for your favorite. So we had our 8 finalists, and I wanted to just show you what they were. These are the ones that are in competition still. Now they were, as I said, they were in each DMV district. The first one, the Bristol district, from Lydia Sluss at Virginia High School, and her slogan or her tagline was "Drive wise and save lives." In the Fairfax North district, we had Stephanie Schmidt from Briarwoods High School in Ashburn, and hers was "Is it worth a life?" Now, again, I want to sort of point out, this is high school students, and we emphasize to high school students that whereas most people think of distracted driving as use of your cell phone, distracted driving is much more than use of your cell phone, and particularly with this age group, because particularly with this age group, one of the biggest distractions other than cell phone is other people in the car. And the statistics are, and I won't go into them, but they're frightening about how fatalities increase based upon the number of people in a car when a teen is driving, unless there's a person over the age of 35, and then it goes down. So you will see that some of these images include things other than cell phones. This one obviously includes, fast food, eating. Matthew Hauser in the Fairfax South District from North Stafford High School, his tagline was "Arrive alive, don't text and drive." We had Abigail Polanski, who contributed this, "One distraction can delay your reaction." Again, you'll see multiple distractions there. Mason Dodzik from Cape Henry Collegiate High School in Virginia Beach with the "Phone down, eyes up" message. Nick Short from Elsie Bird High School in Chesterfield with the message, "Is it worth it?" Kaya Windpainter from Blacksburg High School with "Eyes on the Road." And then finally, Destiny Glover from Nelson County High School in Livingston with "Don't text and drive, save lives," with the emojis. Now, so Commissioner Rick Holcomb, who has been traveling the Commonwealth in each of the 8 districts over the past week to recognize each finalist. And in fact, the commissioner couldn't be here today because he's in Livingston with Destiny Glover, whose "Don't Text and Drive, Save Lives" design was one of the finalists. And you'll see he's been having a really tremendous time recognizing these young people for their work. Each finalist is going to receive a $300 prize courtesy of our partners AAA. And the grand prize winner, who will be announced on April 18th in conjunction with the Week of Distracted Driving Week, which is part of the April Highway Safety Month, hopefully at the Capitol in conjunction with the reconvene session. That grand prize winner will receive $1,000 also from our AAA partner. And I can tell you that so far, as of today, there have been more than 16,000 votes cast, and it's really, really too close to call, so I can't really announce a grand prize winner, but it's really close. And here's the thing, even if we don't sell a single one of these license plates, which I don't think is going to be the case, we consider the contest to have been a huge success because it is getting teenagers and other Virginians across the Commonwealth to really talk about and discuss the dangers of distracted driving. And obviously, we wanted all Virginians to take an active role in this topic, so that's why we chose to do this contest as a way to generate discussion. And we really have earned a tremendous amount of earned media, particularly in those local regions, as you might imagine, where the regional finalists were selected. So we do hope that when the motorists see our winning license plate design, they'll remember to stay focused on driving and save the distractions for when they are safely parked back at home. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you so much for coming.
Sure.
And we will look forward to hearing who the winner is. I will definitely vote. So who knows?
Do it before
Who knows?
11:59 tonight. Yeah.
So anybody have any questions or? Yes.
A question on this legislative session. I know there were a number of bills put forth to tighten up the law regarding distracted driving. Did we have any successes there?
We did not have what I would consider an ultimate success, which would be a bill sitting on Governor Northam's desk.
No bills are...
But however, I will say this, that a single bill passed both the House and the Senate and was sent to a conference committee. That conference committee just happened to never have met. So the bill ultimately was defeated because it never came back from the conference committee. But having said that, it is the first time that we've had a real it was a hands-free bill. I mean, it had some teeth. And so there are some hopeful signs, I would say, that there's maybe a reason to hope that in the future we might get one on the governor's desk.
So in the context of 208 lives that we can document, we wait another year for legislation. Should part of our outreach be an effort to spend more time with the legislators and just convey the urgency of this? In the context of self-reporting 208 deaths, who knows what the actual number is? But it's shocking that we can't get legislation to improve our enforcement by law enforcement to help stem this problem. And I wonder if we shouldn't be pushing very hard in this outreach to the legislators who need to be aware of the problem and take action ultimately.
We have tremendous partners in Virginia. I would like to point out specifically Drive Smart Virginia, who is a lead activist group in this area. They hold a distracted driving conference every year, which is nationally known. They did a lot of work this session and in previous sessions, leading our advocates. So hopefully there will be an opportunity, for the administration perhaps to take a look at it, but we obviously can't do that.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you all for your presentations, and I commend you for the work you've done. I was thinking about taking what you're doing through DMV and sort of merging it with our datathons or hackathons and really focusing on safety as Virginia and Rob and everybody develops these hackathons, going and crowdsourcing ideas from around the Commonwealth. And maybe we can get with the technology community to see if there are some technological solutions to this, because if we want to raise awareness and find solutions, that might be a good thing to focus on. If we're going to focus on safety this year, let's focus on safety and all these things that we're trying to do. Just an idea.
Technology committee.
That's right.
It's busy. Thank you very much. And we'll look forward to working with you.
All right, and again, this is a very important topic, and I appreciate both of y'all's suggestions, and we will take both of those in consideration. And yes, we do need to continue to work with our legislators to make sure that they are aware of these numbers, and that these are people, and we're every year that they delay, there is several hundred more people that will lose their lives because of this. And so we really need to continue to work on this effort. With the competition that's going on, one of the things that VDOT will be doing is that the 8 finalists during the week of distracted driving, they will run those on our overhead message signs so that these folks who submitted these suggestions will be recognized through the week. And again, it begins to bring a focus to distracted driving during that week. And then once the winner is announced on the 18th, then the intent is to run the winner's text message on those overhead message signs. So again, we want to do everything we can to bring attention to the seriousness of this particular issue.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
No, I will just, I'm going to ask Marshall Herman if she'll look up something, but I read, and I think it was in the DRPT news yesterday, on the number of pedestrian deaths. Did you all see it? I know you're shaking your head. The number of pedestrians being killed across the country is going up dramatically. Richmond, as it turns out, is one of the worst cities for pedestrians. So I'm reading the article, and what really surprised me is why these individuals are in these accidents. And it turns out that it's not as much the car as the pedestrians being distracted. The pedestrians are walking with their cell phones, crossing streets, stepping into traffic. So the whole issue of distraction is obviously just a part of our lives. But you had to read the article for a while to get to the point, and you just think, wow, it really is all around us. So, as I, of course, have my cell phone sitting right here. But yes, thank you. Are you going to move right into resiliency?
If you would like, yes.
Yes. Are you going to open? Oh, no, okay.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I will open up Again, thank you, Madam Secretary, members of the board. The three words again are safety, security, and resilience, and the importance of those three words in the development of our projects, the operations of our infrastructure, and the maintenance of our infrastructure. Let me move this thing forward here. So what is resilience? Resilience is the ability to withstand, recover from, or adjust to misfortune or change. I pulled that off as a definition to begin the thought process. It's about bouncing back from a difficult experience. And resilience involves the behavior that must be developed throughout an organization. The organization has to be on board about looking at resilience and being involved. It's about being adaptive and flexible. It's about maintaining a sense of perspective when it comes to our operations. Types of threats that we should be thinking about when we think about resilience is cyber attacks, thefts, natural and man-made disasters, economic, physical crisis. Those are things that we should be looking at. And just, it was interesting as I was preparing for this, it was just 2 days ago, I was listening to the radio when the conversation was about the electric grid here in the United States. And it talked about the threat of hacking. And the conversation that was had during that discussion was not will it happen, it's the fact that it already has happened. Folks just haven't, they've actually been able to get beyond the firewalls to get in, but they have not taken any actions. This is occurring at nation states and, basically rogue groups. We have the same situations that we need to be concerned with in transportation. You look at we talked about our overhead message signs. Those are, could be a threat. Our traffic signals, there are all kinds of infrastructure that we have that we need to make sure that we do all we can to protect it. And again, that we build resilience into those systems so that if something does happen, we can bounce back as the definition says. Another area, just to give you an idea again how important this is, in 2011 there was $366 billion of damage that occurred worldwide based on national disasters. There was $45 billion just here in the United States. So again, it's not a question of will it happen, it is a question when it happens, what can we do to be able to make sure that we can bounce back from that. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to show you a video of a situation that occurred in the state of Georgia where they had an issue and their ability to be able to adjust and show resilience and be able to get their infrastructure back up and going. So with that, I'm hoping yes ma'am.
You open this. I was just going to say that I mentioned to you all I had gone, when the governor was here, I'd gone with him to the White House infrastructure meeting, and I had a chance to go to the National Governors Association meeting and then up to an AASHTO meeting all in D.C. The commissioner and I were at the AASHTO meeting together, but at several different sessions, I will tell you that the issues of safety, security, cybersecurity, and resiliency, building that into your transportation system, was pervasive throughout. And there were really, in fact, they're setting up actually a separate working group that I've asked Quentin to be a part of on these three issues, building this in. And secretaries of transportation from other states were giving presentations, and I learned a lot about what is taking place. Secretary Ron from Maryland was talking about he has their DMV under his umbrella now. He didn't have it originally. But, he talked about the concerns of just the data and information within a system. And look at all the information we are dealing with just on the technology committee. And so he went over to Israel to meet with the Israelis because they have superior protection systems and cybersecurity procedures in place, as have many other organizations have gone there as well. And that's where, he really said it, the secretary went with the idea of what can we do to protect this great system that we have, and the truth is most of our systems have already been invaded. And so what can we do to minimize the risk of all of this? What can we do going forward? So from the cybersecurity end to building redundancy and resiliency into our transportation systems is just a major theme taking place across the country. And some of this is really just to kind of set the stage that as we are making transportation decisions and investment decisions, just to be aware. John Malbin asked a question this morning in technology about, we're talking about the use of drones and incident management, and he posed the questions, well, what about using the arterial routes, not just clearing the accident, but making sure we're aware and planning for, with state police and whoever else we need to have as a partner, making sure we're aware and able to move people at all times. So the commissioner and I had a chance to see this, and I assume now you have as well, in looking at this. This is actually the tail end of what happened, but you're able to see what they went through when they had a major incident.
All right.
When is Keenan Manhattan?
Hey, yes, please. I guess there's some disasters on 85, just around where you go, at 400, and it's a total standstill. There's black, billowing smoke. The lady said she just left her car and fired underneath the expressway.
The smoke is black. That means it is still burning. It is a very healthy fire. You can see it coming up from both sides there of the freeway, of that stretch of road.
When I got there, what I saw was heavy fire and heavy smoke. I was on SR 13, which was State Route 13. My position was above Piedmont Road, which is the land post on Piedmont Road. What I saw was the fire apparatus in place, trying to attempt to make a progression toward the fire. What I did was send out to find out where all my units were located. Knowing where your units are located is and what they're carrying out gives me that safety prospect of knowing exactly where I have and who I have where. So that in the event that something takes place, then I know what units I should be expecting to report to me back as far as safety precautions are concerned.
I was at home Thursday evening when I saw on the news where the road caught on fire and the bridge had collapsed. I looked at my wife then and I was like, I'm just going to have to go. It's extremely early Friday morning, 3 hours. I got ready and came on up here then to begin having to assess the damage and determine what we were going to have to do to build the bridge back.
All right, traffic, everything that's on everybody's mind. Now, I made a comment yesterday that this is kind of a big duh. You're looking at the proverbial cork in the bottom. When you look at the spot of where this occurred, coming off the connector, you can expect that a permanent thing from now on is that northbound on 85 off the connector is going to be shut, just as you see now.
The teamwork to deliver this project with the quality we all look for and demand in every project is outstanding. These folks came together, worked shoulder to shoulder for one common goal of a quality project on time, and in this case, we couldn't be happier it's ahead of time. This is really an outstanding result.
I do have some great news. As of rush hour next Monday morning, the Interstate 85 bridge will be completed and will be open for traffic. bit on this project. It was obviously an honor for our company. We're very humbled to get the call and excited. Our employees from state number 1 have just been excited to be part of this, even the ones that have not been on the project day in and day out. We're just wanting to be a part of this. We know how big it is for the city, for the state.
I always knew Atlanta had a big heart. And on March 30th and subsequently today, we have seen the heart of Atlanta and the heart of Georgia. And I want to congratulate all of you here today for the great job that you have done. We at the Department of Transportation were honored.
What that video demonstrated is that it's not a question, will something happen? It will happen. It's the ability of an organization to rebound from such a situation. And hats off to Georgia. They demonstrated, that they could bounce back and do a great job of getting their infrastructure back up and running. And to do that, it requires that you have a resilient organization. It has to have the capacity to anticipate disruption and to be able to adjust and adapt to that and be able to have a plan to recover from that. And not only do you have to have a resilient organization, you have to have a resilient workforce. You have to have a workforce that has that mindset and the ability to adjust to that. So building a resilient culture in an organization, it's about obtaining leadership support. The leaders have to be bought into and have to emphasize the importance of resilience, and that is what the Secretary is expecting of the transportation agencies, is to make sure that resilience is built into our culture and in our workforce. We want to make sure that our organizations give employees permission to take ownership and the responsibility to address issues when they come up. We don't want them sitting around waiting for someone to tell them what they have to do. Types of things that we need to be looking for when it comes to infrastructure and infrastructure resilience. And this is not a complete list. This is just an illustrative list to say, we need to be looking at our buildings. We need to have a safety focus. Our telecommunications, we need to make sure that if something happens that we're able to bounce back and begin to operate as soon as possible. Electrical, stormwater, and land drainage, that's something that we have a lot of when you look at transportation. And we got to be able to make sure that when something occurs, whether it's hazardous material or other things, that we have the ability to address the issue, bounce back, and get that infrastructure up and running, and make sure that we're protecting the environment. Need to make sure our roadways have resilience. We've got, when you look at it, we've got a lot of tunnels, and we need to make sure that those tunnels continue to operate and that we have adequate resilience in those, whether it's our electrical fans and fire suppression and other things, to make sure that those systems continue to work. Our railways, our ports, whether it's air, sea, or our land ports, we need to make sure that those are able to adjust to and adapt to issues. And just to give you another idea of what we talk about is that we've got a snowstorm in spring. That is another natural disaster that's going to impact our infrastructure. And VDOT is already geared up and has already done preparations to be able to adapt to and to be able to bounce back from that storm and to get Virginia moving again and keep goods and people flowing through Virginia. And with that, I'd like to, that's just one example. The other thing that, resilience is about making sure that we have, we start with our strategies. We look at making sure our strategies has resilience built into it. And once you do that, you got to make sure that your processes, everything that you do, you should be thinking about not just what it takes to get the job done, but if something happens to that, how can your processes allow you to bounce back and be able to adjust to anything that may occur or may happen, all the way down to making sure that your facilities are secure. And so with that, what I'm going to do is ask Commissioner Britch to come up, and he's going to talk to you about some of the things that VDOT is currently doing in the area of resilience to make sure that we are doing what we can to make sure that our infrastructure is strong and it can bounce back when things occur. So with that, Commissioner.
Thank you, Quentin. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time recognizing what VDOT already has in place today and some of the works that we'll have ongoing here in the next couple of months as well. You saw something that was fairly catastrophic on Interstate 85 in the downtown. And we had something fairly catastrophic, I think, in my opinion, here just recently, the Potomac Mill Sign in Northern Virginia, that held hostage Interstate 95 for 2 days, 5 hours, and 42 minutes. And I can probably count down the seconds until we took down that sign. Part of that, though, is making sure that we have detour plans in place should an incident occur. And the good news is for the major metropolitan areas, we have that in place. So if an incident occurs between an interchange, we've already got a playbook that identifies the surface streets that we're going to use, the signal timings that are going to be there, and the detour routes that are going to be present. That work is ongoing for all the major interstates on 64, 81, and 95 to make sure that we have all those detour plans in place for all those interstate facilities. Now, Mr. Malvin, you asked the question earlier about using the arterial systems, and it's certainly down in the Hampton Roads region. There's a great opportunity to leverage the investments and work with those communities. And the good news is Virginia Beach and the department have a very good working relationship. Should an incident occur on the arterial system, they notify the department, and we can adjust what happens on the interstate and vice versa. If we're going to be shifting traffic over, we'll give them the advance notification and allow them to retime their signals on the arterial system to handle that greater influx of traffic. That coordination is getting broadly disseminated to other locations. I think the Hampton Roads region may be leaders in that area right now. The second part of this is making sure that we have an integrated corridor management system in place that looks not only at the highway mode of transportation, but uses all modes of transportation in case we have a man-made or a natural disaster. Right now, we are working on an integrated corridor management plan in the Northern Virginia region. We don't have that stood up, but we're working with all modal agencies to put together a strategic plan on how we would use that. To the success of what happened in Georgia, they found themselves needing to use transit and all modes of transportation to cure that traffic bottleneck that we had. So the work on the ICM is certainly something that's needed not only in Northern Virginia, but other locations throughout the Commonwealth to take advantage of our multimodal network. As Quentin said, we are due for a little bit of snow here over the next 24 hours, and pre-staging equipment is going to be a key. We're already pre-staging wrecker services along the 81 corridor to make sure that if an incident does occur, we can clear that incident quickly and restore it back to traffic. So pre-staging equipment is one opportunity. We're using something else for our towing and recovery program right now is instant tow, where if police are called out or state police are called out, we're sending out the tow truck at the exact same time, not waiting for police to get there, assess the situation, and then have to wait until traffic builds, potential for secondary incidents to occur. We've got things in motion right away. And then we also have the towing and recovery incentive program. And this is predominantly where we have large commercial vehicles that do have those accidents, overturned vehicles, where if we can get that incident cleared within 90 minutes, we will give an incentive back to the towing and recovery team to be able to open up the facility quicker. Evacuation programs that we have in place right now are going to be key. And this goes back to, let's view evacuation programs not just in the natural disaster, but also man-made incidents that do occur. 9/11 would have been a key. We have Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C., Hampton Roads being the military facilities. So we do have evacuation plans in place, again, for Hampton Roads to divert traffic on the eastbound lanes of 64, contraflow them all the way back out to the city of Richmond and let it disperse there. Similar with the capital region, should we need to have traffic outbound, we have plans in place today. We've over the last, I want to say 20 years that we've been developing and refining those plans, we've also identified what other states have used. South Carolina, for example, did contraflow traffic this past summer to be able to extricate everyone in advance of the hurricane. Some of the lessons learned that we found out of South Carolina, Houston, and other places are that we need to have supporting contracts in place day one. We know that people are going to leave without a full tank of gasoline and are going to be stuck in traffic for a while. They will likely run out of gas. So we have service contracts in place that if we need to, or if we do contraflow traffic, we'll be in a position to have pre-stage gasoline service to be able to get them off the facility and not be a roadblock in this case. So resiliency to our traffic operations centers. The eyes and ears of the department right now, identifying where crashes occur, incidents occur, and how traffic is flowing. We do have resiliency that are built into it from the utility side. We do have backup generator power and at all the facilities, and to that same point, we have redundant communications to be able to make sure that we maintain communications with not only ourselves, but emergency responders. The operating systems, the facilities along the 81 corridor, Northwest region and Southwest region have failover capabilities, which means that if for some reason something happens in the Northwest Regional Operations Center in Stanton, we'll be able to take full control over all their assets out of Salem and vice versa. And the good news is, well, maybe not the good news is, we've had to exercise it and it works. The central region does have failover capabilities to the northwest and southwest, and we're working on the northern region right now. We anticipate that failover capability to take place in 2018, as well as the eastern region once we implement their new system. I think that we'll get the eastern region up and running before the end of the calendar year 2018. Now going to something a little bit low-tech from a resiliency standpoint is our traffic signals. We know that if a nor'easter comes through, a hurricane or a snow event, the wind event here recently that took out the Potomac Mill sign, hurricane force winds, we lost a lot of our signals just due to power interruptions or down trees and power lines. Signals in this case, we are using battery backup UPS devices to be able to keep them online, but we also know that they run out of power after about 8 hours. But where we have them, we're pre-staging them on the critical corridors, the corridors of statewide significance or entrances into our critical infrastructure, for example, tunnels. But we're also designing those signals cabinets to have hookups on their cabinets for generators to be plugged in, or portable generators, so that as we go if we do have an incident, we can hook up a generator, repower the battery system, go to the next one, and repower them along the way. So not every signal needs to have a generator backup. But even on the low-tech, and shown in the signal, in the pictures, that we're using retroreflective backplates on our devices to call attention, one, to the signal being there, but also if that signal goes dark for some reason, we'll see the signal being or not being lit and call their attention to at least being a signal there. And that transforms itself back into a four-way stop, and people at least know that there's a signal or a crossroad in advance. So that's a little bit about the resiliency that the department has in place. Quentin?
Any thoughts or questions for the commissioner? Yes, sir.
I do. Madam Chairman, thank you. And thank you all for this presentation. You asked me what smart cities can do. This is what smart cities are doing. So I'll work on that, getting us plugged into that working group headed by CIT and Commerce, because this is exactly the stuff they're talking about and thinking about, and actually building new companies trying to find solutions for this, and we should be part of that.
I couldn't agree with you more.
The thing keeps coming to mind is the, well, cybersecurity. I think we got to have a whole briefing on that, but the 511 app, the lady called 511, and we've talked about the 511 app. I think we've talked about it for about 4 years on the committee. And if you know, I've heard we might do away with it, we might keep it. It looks like we're going to keep it. And if we're going to keep the 511 app, let's make it good, and let's make it able to push information out to people. Let's make it useful. I don't know who's using it today, and is DMV. If we're going to make it useful, is DMV helping us to market the use of that? When you get your license or when you renew your license, you should download the 511 app. If we're going to have it, if we're going to use it and spend money maintaining it, let's make it useful for these kinds of things. I would think we should do that, because obviously we're keeping it, and I don't know what the status of the 511 app is, but it's a useful tool.
And I think we need to always continue to evaluate the different systems we have to make sure that they're still valid and that we need to have them. And so, the question is, yes, we still have 511, but as the private sector or as technology continues to grow, we need to evaluate, are there other providers that can provide similar or better service? So again, yes, and if we're going to keep it, we need to make sure that we do everything we can to market it.
You've got the 511, that belongs to us, right? It's a federally designated number. So whoever provides the backbone technology for that, it's still a 511 app. So underneath it, it really doesn't matter who's coming up with the solutions. It should be the private sector, because I don't think, well, I think it should be the private sector, and some of these competitions we've been talking about, maybe coming up with another hackathon, figuring out how to make it more robust.
And I think your committee is one that we need to continue to work with, to continue to evaluate and look to see what options are available, and we need to include the private sector and anyone else that has an idea that they think can make getting the right information to the public better. Okay.
Thank you.
And we will, this was just kind of an introduction to what this is, and what we could be looking at as we're making decisions. So this is just a first kind of introductory thing. We will move far more in depth with security at some point. So anything else? All right, well, Deputy Secretary Donahue asked me a little while ago about the agenda for the rest of the day. So perhaps this is a good time to find out where everybody may want to, whether or not, what decisions we would want to make. So do you want to let people know what our options are?
We have dinner reservations at 6 o'clock at Acacia. It's about a 15 to 20-minute ride from the hotel we're staying at. I have managed to check everybody in already, so that will save a little bit of time. I guess the decision is, how much time do people want to spend at the hotel before they get on the shuttle?
So it's about 4:17 right now. So would you all like to go through one more presentation? Would you like to break, go back to the hotel? I'm a little concerned about traffic. So,
It's 30 minutes from here to the hotel.
so, and I will say that the hotel situation was a bit of a surprise.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. So we'll just leave it there. But we will try to address that at a different time. So if it takes 30 minutes, and what time's the shuttle?
It's going to be there at 5:30. We could.
So I guess maybe this is a good time to break? Okay, no, let's stay. This side of the table definitely wants to break. This side of the table is looking very student. And the other option is Nick. I don't know.
I think everybody should dress comfortably tonight. The weather's going to be bad. It's going to be a little cold. I don't
Bad.
see why.
So the shuttle will pick them up at the
At the
hotel?
hotel at 5:30.
At 5:30. And you have the keys?
I already have the keys.
Wow.
Yes.
So Brenda went out and picked up your keys for you.
Wow.
Bless Brenda.
Yes.
Yeah, oh, good.
Where's Brenda? We should say thank
Where's
you.
the hotel?
And so with that, we'll suspend to tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock?
Yes, ma'am.
And if I had a gavel, I'd do that. Thank you.
Got clear path.